Assalamualaikum, good morning, maayong aga, magandang umaga sa lahat. Welcome everybody and thank you for joining us today. This is the second day of our multi-stakeholder discussion that seeks to envision good governance and fiscal policy of mining in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, which we will refer to as BARMM all throughout the discussion. My name is Gelson Garcia. I'm an independent consultant that led the BARMM Mining Governance Assessment Initiative, a project of Bantay Kita that organized this event. I will be your moderator for the entire discussion today. We are pleased to co-host this two-day event with the BARMM's Ministry of the Environment, Natural Resources and Environment, or MENRE, a key agency that has expanded mandates, and the Institute of Autonomy and Governance, known to most of you as the leading policy center on governance and human security in the southern Philippines. Very quickly, let me run you through the basics and house rules so we're all aligned on the flow and how you can engage with your questions, insights. First, on the why and the purpose of this discussion. And second, what's the flow, who's speaking, and how you can provide your feedback. On the why and the purpose, in June and July 2021, Bantay Kita organized stakeholder consultations and validation in Tawi-Tawi and Cotabato City about the report, which most of you will have already reviewed. The report lays out the findings on the quality of mining governance in the Bangsamoro region. This study was undertaken in 2018 until June 2019. So this study basically cut across the ARM days and also the early period of the BARMM. And the assessment used a benchmarking framework called Natural Resource Charter, which has been used in many resource-rich countries and regions where governments find its importance in informing the reform of the oil, gas and mining policies, institutions, or in improving their practices. This is a complementary tool that many governments now are using along with other instruments such as findings, reports, recommendations from EITI and other important studies as well. The stakeholder representatives in BARMM's policymaking and executive bodies, mining companies, local government units, civil society and mining host companies were engaged in those consultations and validation exercises. Their response, overall, they confirmed the relevance of the assessment results and supported the recommendations that informed the mining sector reform. And the details or the highlight of this will be presented by Mr. Dats Abdilwin Samkula a little later. As Bantay Kita is launching the latest iteration of the report, we are co-hosting this multi-stakeholder discussion with MENRE in IAG, which started yesterday and today is the final one. The initiative is focused on building the technical and comparative knowledge of the Bangsamoro mining stakeholders as they begin the process of developing the key policy recommendations for the new mining code and related fiscal and sector development strategies. Yesterday, our focus was what does the future hold for mining in the aftermath of the pandemic and their policy implications to BARMM. It was live streamed live, and many of you participating today joined us yesterday, and this is now available in Bantay Kita and IAG Facebook Live. Today, our focus is in mining policy Fiscal Policy for BARMM's mining sector. So what lessons can we draw from the Philippines and Peru and other countries? So we're doing a blended approach. So some of us are joining from the IAG conference room, while most of you are joining us virtually. The event is also being live streamed on Facebook. Yesterday, we have over 200 views on the Facebook Live, while we had significant participation from the Bangsamoro leadership as well as civil society, not just in BARMM, but also in the Philippines and beyond. Now, on host speaking and when can you come in to share feedback, our speakers include the national, international experts and industry practitioners themselves. We also have respondents from the Bangsamoro region, including leaders from BARMM's ministries, other executive offices, and the committees in the Bangsamoro Transition Authority of the Parliament. We also have sufficient room for civil society organizations that work closely with the communities, mining companies in Tawi-Tawi, and some policy think tanks to share their feedback and also to react on the discussion. We have 3 hours for this discussion, and the flow of our session is in the next slide. Next slide, please. All right, so what you see there is after Mr. Vince Lasatin's video recording that introduces the Bantay Kita and the purpose of this discussion, we will have Mr. Dato Abdelwin Samkula to present the highlights of the report specific to the fiscal regime part. Then we enter the panel discussion with distinguished panel of speakers, including Dr. Sheila Magno from the UP School of Economics, and then Dr. Carlos Monge, now the advisor of Ministry of Finance in Peru and the former Latin America Director of Natural Resource Governance Institute, and Attorney Brenda J. Mendoza, who is the country manager of the EITI International Secretariat. Then our panel of reactors include Attorney Ishak Mastura, who is the chairperson of the Bangsamoro Board of Investment. And then we also have panel of reactors from Chansey Mining, as well as Mina Bida di Mindanao to join us later. After that, we'll have at least 45 minutes for an open forum, then some wrap up. So that's the way we are organizing our discussion today. So I think we are ready. And on that note, let's hear from Bantay Kita, Mr. Vince Lasatin, about the background and purpose of this discussion.
Assalamualaikum. Good day. I'm Vincent Lasatin, the National Coordinator for Bantay Kita. Bantay Kita is a nationwide coalition of non-government and civil society organizations and academic institutions advocating for transparency and accountability in the extractives industry. The membership is composed of organizations that work in the area of natural resource governance, environmental protection, human, political, civil, and indigenous peoples' rights, as well as organizations that represent mining-affected communities. As an advocate for better natural resource governance, Bantay Kita works in several arenas. First is in the area of policy. We work with key policymakers, senators, and congressmen to push for policies and legislation that improve transparency and accountability in the extractive sector. To support evidence-based decision and policymaking, Bantay Kita produces research and studies to help inform decision makers. Some of the research includes work on responsible mining, a scoping study on the mining downstream industry, and a study on the local coal industry. Bantay Kita has worked with legislators to craft bills on the institutionalization of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative and reforms in the mining fiscal regime. Second, Bantay Kita engages in capacity building and training. In order for all stakeholders in the extractive industry to participate meaningfully, they must be capacitated to make informed decisions. Bantay Kita regularly conducts trainings and capacity building activities for communities, local government units, government agencies, academia, and other relevant stakeholders. Lastly, Bantay Kita is an active member of the multi-stakeholder group of the Philippine Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. The EITI, as it is known for short, is a global initiative implemented locally to bring greater transparency to the extractive industry. Through its participation in the Philippine EITI, Bantay Kita works with representatives from other civil society organizations, the Philippine government, and the extractive industry to, among other things, ensure that the government and communities are receiving what they should in the form of taxes and royalties from the companies engaged in extractive activities. Recent data have shown that mining in the Bangsamoro region has the potential to be an economic driver and significant source of revenue for the government. Taxes, wealth share, and royalties can be an important source of revenue that can fuel the economy and provide fiscal independence for Bangsamoro. At the same time, we know that mining is very controversial and prone to corruption, mismanagement, and is many times the primary cause for irreversible environmental degradation. In order to ensure that the economic benefits are maximized, while at the same time the environment is protected for future generations, good governance in the natural resources sector is an absolute must. It is only through good governance of natural resources that all the competing interests in the mining industry can be balanced. Without the burden of legacy legislation and institutions, the Bangsamoro stands with a blank sheet of paper upon which it can write the laws, create the institutions, and develop a framework where the greatest benefits will redound to the greatest number of people in a sustainable fashion. As part of its public policy interventions and capacity building efforts, and through a USAID-funded project called Deepening Access, Transparency and Accountability to Improve Natural Resource Governance and Empower Communities, or Project DATA for short, Bantay Kita is working with the Ministry of Environment, Natural Resources and Energy, and the Institute of Autonomy and Governance to conduct this two-day multi-stakeholder discussion entitled Envisioning Good Governance and Fiscal Policy of Mining in the Bangsamoro region. The overall purpose of this two-day discussion is to help build the technical and comparative knowledge of the Bangsamoro stakeholders. The Bangsamoro is in a critical stage in its development as it starts to craft laws and policies regarding the mining sector. This is of utmost importance as it begins to consider the relationship between a revenue system and the broader development strategy. The first day will focus on the impact of COVID-19 on the mining industry and how this may affect mining in the BARMM region and what reform measures it should undertake. This discussion is highly relevant for the development of a mining code and associated fiscal and sector development strategies. The second day will then take a look at mining fiscal policy for sustainable development and draw lessons from both the Philippines and Peru. Looking at these two cases will hopefully be instructional to all BARMM stakeholders as you consider the role of mining and its impacts in the context of sustainable development. I hope this short backgrounder puts you all in the right frame of mind for the next 2 days as we tackle some very important matters that will determine the future of mining and the extractive industry in BARMM. Bantay Kita stands ready to work with government, industry, communities, the academia, and other relevant stakeholders in ensuring natural resource governance that is beneficial to the greatest number of people and one that looks towards a sustainable future for Bangsamoro. We are very happy to be working with MENRE and IAG during this very exciting time. Most especially, we hope to contribute our experience and expertise to BARMM as it works towards sustainable mining policies that draws lessons from our past to create a brighter future for the people of Bangsamoro. Thank you, and let us have a fruitful discussion.
Vince, I know that you have recorded it just to mitigate any technical glitch with your connection. But Vince is actually joining us live, and he's happy to address any questions regarding the report as well as on uh, to participate in the panel discussion today. So, Vince, so just to recognize his presence here. All right. So on that note, before I turn over to Mr. Samkula, I just want to quickly show in 3 minutes how this report was produced. So there's a video there that will be flashed on your screen now. Okay, thank you. And for some of you who are not well familiar with the Natural Resource Charter, which was the framework used for this study to inform the analysis and the recommendations in this report, what is being flashed on your screen now or shortly is the Natural Resource Charter framework in one slide. But basically, this is a tool that has been used in many resource-rich governments in situations where government stakeholders, civil society, academics, and others would like to have a much deeper and substantive and technical assessment on the quality of the oil, gas, and mining governance. Here, there's a specific attention to the so-called decision chain, which you see in the middle in orange, which actually look at the domestic foundations for resource governance. Here, we look at the regulatory framework, institutional framework, the accountability mechanisms, civil society participation also included. And then under the decision to extract, we look at the systems and practices for exploration and allocating licenses. And then the third decision chain is getting a good deal, which is one of the main components of the fiscal regime discussion today. And we look at the taxation. We also looked at the local effects, while there's also a state-owned enterprise, but we did not cover that because there's no government-owned and controlled corporation or SOE that exists for mining industry in Bangsamoro. Maybe they could consider that in the future. And then the other part of the fiscal regime discussion today is about the managing revenues. And there we look specifically at the revenue sharing, the revenue distribution, also the volatility. And I'm sure that the mining companies here represented can relate to that. And then we also look at the investing for sustainable development. So we look at the government spending and private sector development. Yesterday, we had a conversation about to what extent social development fund and other funds allocated for project affected communities are also, whether or not they are also linked with the broader development strategy, either at the municipal, provincial level, or at the regional development strategy. Then there was a look also at how international community and or the standards apply to the practices in mining resource-rich areas such as Tawi-Tawi. So today, my colleague, Mr. Dats Abdelwin Samkula, will present the key findings on the fiscal side and also the policy options that we have laid out in the report, which is going to inform this discussion. Very quickly, Mr. Dato Abdelwin Samkula is the former Assistant Secretary for the DENR arm during the time, and is also the consultant for this assessment project. So over to you, Mr. Dats Samkula, to present the highlights of the report.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gelson Garcia, the lead consultant for this project. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And exciting morning to everyone gathered here at the IAG Training Center or via Zoom. Before I'll present to you the our key findings on the BARMM's mining governance study, I beg your indulgence by allowing me to just quickly state the following scope and limitations of this assessment. One, the study was conducted during the time of BARMM and the early part of the BARMM's transition from July 2018 up to June 2019. Secondly, the study did only focus on mining, especially metallic minerals, and other resources like oil and gas, petroleum, among others, which are also part of the overall mineral resources, were not part of this study due to limited time frame and resources. And last but not least, the fiscal data, such as the gross regional domestic product, tax payments, and other revenues generated from July 2019 to 2021 were not also part of the overall assessment. So those were the limitation, the scope and limitations of this study. Now, what are the key findings of the mining governance assessment? Yesterday, I presented the key findings of the mining governance assessment, but focusing on what we think are the governance deficits as far as mining is concerned. And this morning, as we will be discussing the mining fiscal policy for sustainable development of the BARMM, I will be articulating again, the key findings, but showing some fiscal data to back up our analysis on the state of the region's mining fiscal policy. Our key findings would show that mining is not yet, next slide please, mining is not yet a key growth driver. Yesterday, I did mention that the general value added of mining to gross regional domestic product in the year 2017 was only at 0.44%. That is far below the national GVA of 0.65%, which is also very insignificant. And for the record, the gross regional domestic product of ARM in 2017 was at 7.3% compared to 0.04% in 2016. And it was so far the highest economic growth rate in the history of ARM.
Yung iba naman po kasi yung mga ma'am ladies.
Again, when we say a gross value added, we are referring in this context to the economic productivity, measuring the contribution of the mining sector to the regional economy. And although ARM has posted, as I mentioned earlier, a 7.3% growth rate in 2017 from 2012, which is actually higher than the national performance of 6.7%, the mining contribution to the regional economy is still relatively small. Data shows that mining and quarrying combined as part of the industry sector, which also includes electricity, gas, water, construction, and manufacturing, has the least contribution to the sector, which is pegged at 12.9%. In 2017, the industry sector, next up please. Okay. The industry sector has the least contribution to GRDP at 5.9% compared with agriculture, forestry, and fishing, which is pegged at 56.4%, and services sector at 37.7%. So in terms of the volume of the production, it remains to be limited since exploration and extraction only started in 2012. And the data that we had on the measured and unidentified mineral resources estimated at 18.5 million wet metric tons with a minimum of 9.9 million wet metric tons on mineable reserve were all taken from the existing MPSAs and the mining feasibility studies of the mining companies. So DNR then had no independent data of its own as far as mineral endowments are concerned. Next slide, please. Okay. One of the findings also is that mining is far from being a major generator of stable jobs and associated livelihoods. Based on the data that we gathered from the Philippine Statistics Authority, the PSA, in 2017, the annual labor and employment estimate shows the mining sector contributed only 0.29% share to the total regional employment during the time. And during the assessment period, the SLRMC, for example, one of the mining companies there in Tawi-Tawi was winding down their operations and therefore resulting in cutting jobs. Next slide. So the graph shows that there was an exponential growth in terms of mining revenues from 14% in 2012 to around 78% in 2015, and 2014 rather, and 73% in 2015. But it went down to 37% in 2016 due to the suspension order issued by the armed government then. So if you notice, the increase was due to the revised revenue law, which imposed a regional wealth tax from 1% of 0.5% to 5%. So the Regional Legislative Assembly then passed amended the existing revenue code then, which increased the wealth tax from 0.5% to 5%. However, overall, next slide, please. Overall, if the contribution of the mining sector to the regional economy is still relatively small, as shown in the pie chart. Next slide. Okay. Another finding is that the mining legal framework is not robust. No, provisions, for example, on mining tax and revenue sharing are weak. Next. There is hardly any open and comprehensive resource data, including lacking provisions on social development spending and other revenue management. And the third, mining activities fall short of minimum safeguard standards, including oversight. So these three findings, you can see the details in our assessment report. Next slide, please. For the policy considerations, in yesterday's session, we also reiterated the policy considerations that need to be prioritized. And one of these is the development of a robust mining code. As the Bangsamoro Transition Authority is drafting its the mandatory revenue code, it is important to incorporate the fiscal contributions of mining and how it seeks to improve mining taxation, revenue collection, and distribution in support to the fiscal autonomy goal. The BOL gives us the primary legal instrument to define the strategic direction for managing mineral and other natural resources. That's why if you look at Article 4, Sections 34 to 36 of the BOL on the fiscal autonomy, it has defined a different set of agreements on exploring and utilizing minerals, which prioritizes the management authority and revenue share of regional government and constituent local government units, as well as the equitable share of the indigenous cultural communities. This should be clearly reflected in the mining code that the BARMM government has to legislate. So those are the findings. And if I may add, on the use of the financial model tools, data that need revising, the fiscal rule for mining. One of the fiscal modeling tools is the use of the financial analysis for resource industries. Is a very powerful tool. When I was able to attend a short course on this, it was very helpful in our decision-making process, especially in terms of projection. For example, during the last time of RLA ARM, there was an attempt to amend the to pass a new mining code, and they were saying that law, or that bill rather, imposed a 15-year duration for the issuance for the MPSA, but there was no really basis, why it was 15 years, why it was not 25 years or 10 years. So I think FARI could be a good instrument to determine the extent of the mining operations, as well as depending on the taxation regime that the BARMM government would impose. So these are the policy considerations that hopefully the Bangsamoro government would consider in the passage of the mining code. So thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi taala wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Mr. Samkula. I think that's quite clear, and hopefully that can spark further discussion later. So I just want to call if we have check if we have Dr. Sheila Magno. Is she in the room?
Hi, Gelson. I'm here virtually.
Oh, okay. So you could, all right. Thanks, Sheila, for joining us. I know that you are busy, but we want to make sure that we tap your brains in for this discussion. But very briefly, Dr. Sheila Magno is the associate professor in the School of Economics at the University of the Philippines. In 2019, she has produced a peer-reviewed paper which evaluated the large-scale mining company fiscal regime in the Philippines. And we have actually referred that in our report. And because she's also been to many other countries and having been a member of the EI International Global Board of Directors, and she had the opportunity to do an audit of the government's EITI report with an eye specifically on the fiscal regime reporting and others. And she's also the former national coordinator of Bantay Kita. So it's good to really have an academic with that kind of combined expertise, also looking at the reports and engaging also with the government and the mining company. So Dr. Sheila, I know that you don't have a presentation, which is good, but I think what we have prepared for you to consider addressing is what is the current mining development framework in the Philippines for those who are yet to reorient themselves? What challenges does the industry face in optimizing its potential to reduce poverty and share prosperity in mineral-rich regions? And in your analysis, are the national and subnational governments in the Philippines, as well as the affected communities, getting a good deal in terms of benefits from mining and other payments? What can be done differently to improve mining taxation and revenue sharing in the Philippines? What lessons do you think can we draw from good practices of other countries? So those are loads of questions. I know that these are questions that will be relevant to the discussion, not just on mining code, but also to the revenue code, which is also one of the priorities of the Bangsamoro Transition Authority. So you have the floor, Sheila.
All right, thank you, Gelson. And it's good to see everyone virtually. I think my good friend Carlos Monge is also here, so good to tap his brain and get some inputs regarding Peru. And I'm very happy that you gave me very specific questions to answer and share this morning. So let me start about the question on what is the current development framework of the Philippines, and what challenges does the industry face in optimizing its potential to reduce poverty and share prosperity in mineral-rich regions. So ayoko naman i-dampen yung spirit natin kasi ang aga-aga, diba? So there are actually good things about the development framework in the Philippines. Of course, it's good that you've already introduced the resource charter framework. I think that's a good, it provides good core principles in terms of evaluating the sector. And I think that's a good framework to adapt. In our context, yes, we recognize that the mineral sector has the potential to contribute and become a pillar for development in the country. We also recognize that the people are the owners of the minerals. And I think that's a good thing. The other one is that our existing laws have provisions on on the sharing of the extraction. It recognizes that communities have the right to get a share from the extraction of these resources. It recognizes that subnational governments or local government units are entitled to have a share of this mineral resources. So those are good framework as well. More importantly, we have the free, prior, and informed consent of the indigenous community. And the way the FPIC is framed in the Philippines, it's not a token FPIC. What do I mean by token FPIC? In some areas, sometimes FPIC is seen as just a process of bargaining and negotiation. It's a way of delaying the yes answer of the community, right? So imagine you having a suitor, and your suitor is always there badgering you just to say yes on to the person. But in the Philippines, the way we frame FPIC is that communities can actually say no. If they don't want extraction in their community, then that's the end of the conversation. Theoretically, that's how we frame the law. So it's good. It's not a continuing process until a community says yes, but the communities actually have a power to say no, we don't want mining or any extractive activities in our community based on the information that we have. So that's a very strong policy conceptually. Bakit lagi kong kina-qualify conceptually? I will explain later. And in terms of thinking about development and intergenerational ownership, I think the local government code has a good provision stating that the proceeds from this national wealth that has been extracted have to be used for local development. But it stops at that. But at least it's there. So there's a recognition that these minerals are intergenerationally owned. So meaning if we extract now, extract everything now, that has an impact or an effect on the welfare of future generation. And because we recognize that these minerals are owned by everyone, unlike in the United States where minerals are privately owned, in the Philippines, everyone owns the mineral resource, not just the people from the area, but the whole country. So that's also very important. Another thing that I think is also nice about our existing policy framework in the Philippines is a recognition of the role of the community, civil society in governance. So Gelson already mentioned that we have EITI, we're implementing it, so it significantly improved transparency in the sector. But at the same time, there are different provisions in our laws, the Mining Code, the Local Government Act, where the role of civil society and governance are recognized. Specifically in the mining sector, we have civil society representatives supposedly in the Provincial Mining Regulatory Board. We have civil society representation in the monitoring team to make sure that companies are compliant with environmental standards. So those are good conceptual framework. So now we go to the gaps. What are the challenges? And it's good also that the concept of resource curse was introduced in the evaluation framework of Bangsamoro. So when we say resource curse, it's really it has several components. When I was in Bantay Kita, I am in this. I'm always conflicted because we always look at the national macro data and says that, oh, mining companies, you're only contributing very low in terms of GDP, or less, your contribution is less than 1%. And we use it as criticism. But come to think of it, if you're managing a portfolio, you actually don't want an economy that's completely dependent on one sector. You want to have diversity in that sector, because if you have diversity in your sources of income, then your vulnerability is reduced. And in most mining countries, one reason why you have resource curse is because when prices of minerals fluctuate and when your economy is dependent on that sector, then the flow of revenue to the government becomes volatile also. So it becomes problematic and it becomes more challenging in terms of managing your public finance. Later, I will explain another way in terms of how we evaluate the economic contribution of the mining sector. I think I only have 15 minutes now, but well, I'm only on the second question. So what other gaps have I identified in terms of our policy framework and extractive sector? I think one important thing in terms of getting the most in extracting these resources is in the contracting process. In the Philippines, the way we contract the sector is it's a first come, first served basis. So whoever applies first gets the contract, gets to apply. In other countries, if governments have greater knowledge of the resource that they have, they can actually auction the the right to extract in a certain area. So when you do auction, you actually have a better chance of getting a better deal as opposed to just a first come, first served basis. This is not unique in the mining sector. This is a challenge in the way we regulate industries in the Philippines. Medyo malayo, but a concrete example is, remember a few days ago when we announced that the ABS-CBN channel is now Villar, owned by the Villar. It's because they're the first to apply. That's it. Wouldn't it be more robust or beneficial if we can actually auction and get several proposals and review these proposals and see which company is offering the best to the country in terms of operating and extracting this mineral resource. But we don't have that option. Para kang pag nililigawan ka, gusto mo ba isa lang yung manliligaw mo at isa lang yung sasabihan mo ng yes. So parang yun lang yung option mong maging asawa, as opposed to marami kang manliligaw, marami kang i-evaluate, marami kang i-assess, marami kang mapipili mo kung sino yung the best among all your suitors. So that's our problem. And the only way to be able to do that is if we have knowledge of kung ano ba yung ino-auction natin. The problem in the Philippines is we have very limited knowledge of the value of our resource. We only have an estimate. So kung hindi konkreto yung knowledge natin ng deposito, kailangan very specific yung deposit sa specific site, then it's a challenge kung paano ka magpapa-auction. But that's something that governments or the Bangsamoro might consider, especially if you are confident about the deposits in the area. You can invest. So instead of allowing companies to explore, it's the government that explores. And it's a government that explores and that they open the process for bidding. The other gaps that we have right now is because the environmental context has changed. Traditionally, what they do is only look at the traditional impact of mining on flora and fauna. Ito yung mga kasama sa application ng mining companies, environmental impact assessment. But the context has changed. We have climate change. And I think it's very important that when government asks for impact assessment from mining companies, that we incorporate how these activities will aggravate the impact of changes in climate in the community. Another gap that I'm seeing is the way we also enforce the FPIC. And maybe in some of the sessions that we have here right now with other experts, there will be further discussion on the FPIC, but it has always been problematic in terms of how we implement it. How much information does the community really have to make that informed consent? What is the process? Things like that have to be reviewed and reconsidered. The concept is good, but we should genuinely implement it. The same with this. I forgot to emphasize, but in the context of the Philippines, FPIC is not just limited to indigenous people. The local government code recognizes communities' right to participate in decisions like this. So that's why before any extractive activities can proceed, local governments have to have a resolution agreeing on the extractive activities. And that resolution is not exclusively based on a decision of local legislation, local legislative members. Communities have to be engaged and they have to participate in the process of resolving the issue on whether they want mining or not. That's powerful. And if it's strengthened, I think we can have a better foundation in terms of managing the sector. Sorry, dami kong listahan. And then, of course, representation. How do you select civil society representative? What's the process? What's the extent of their participation? Two more important things: maximizing the extractive sector. We know that they extract raw minerals from us. We export unprocessed. Buhangin po yung in-export natin. We don't even know kung magkano ba talaga yung minerals na nandun sa unprocessed minerals na ine-extract sa atin. Except for gold and copper, they're more or less processed, but in terms of nickel, it's mostly unprocessed. And so the monitoring in terms of how much really was being extracted and whether we're getting a good deal in terms of taxation, that's just a wild guess based on the information companies are providing to us. So it will be good to actually have greater transparency, stronger monitoring in terms of the value of minerals that are being extracted. And EITI might be able to help on that, and implementing EITI not just at the national level, but at the subnational level, monitoring the volume of minerals exiting in the country, monitoring environmental compliance, and reporting and making all these reports available to the public would be helpful in terms of communities understanding what's going on in the operation of the extractive in their communities. Another thing that's I think important to consider right now is the downstream integration. So as I said, we are exporting raw minerals, but imagine if we use these minerals as inputs to industries in the country. This is a more complicated discussion because we have to do an evaluation on the cost of extraction, but ideally in the framework, I think the country has to explore the possibility of really having an integrated downstream sector so that we, aside from the extractive sector, we can have manufacturing, electronics, etc. All those industries that are dependent or at least are getting inputs from the extractive sector. So like for example, with the climate change and the goal to have a greener economy, there's greater demand for solar panels, solar energy efficient vehicles. These kinds of products require input from the extractive sector. So the development of the downstream sector is also very important in terms of having that framework. Another important point is intergenerational equity, the recognition that that minerals, these natural resources, are intergenerationally owned. I said in my previous discussion in Good Points that we have that provision in the local government code that says the proceed from this national wealth should be used for local development. The gap is we have not identified, or the definition of local development is so broad that local governments actually have the flexibility to just spend the money on whatever they think is contributing to development. So this is something that I think the community, the government has to figure out. In other countries, there are various mechanisms to ensure that the extractive sector is contributing on intergenerational equity. One is making sure that we invest the proceeds of mining to programs, projects that would benefit various generations, investing in strong, better health programs, education, infrastructure that have long-term impacts. Other countries also invest or set up sovereign wealth fund. But that question also, again, is dependent on how huge the money is. Because sovereign wealth fund will have transactions cost. It will have governance cost also in terms of implementation. But just to give an example on how good the important intergenerational equity is and management of fund is, sorry, I don't have presentation. Gelson asked me to do a lecture instead of focusing on a PowerPoint, but I have a paper. My old papers all actually cover all these topics that I'm discussing. But look at Norway right now. They have a sovereign, an oil fund, but they have huge revenue coming from oil. And all this funding that they're using now during COVID to provide subsidy in each household comes from their oil fund. But most of the time, they actually do not touch the fund. They just let it grow and invest it in different financial markets. So it's like having your money, it's like having savings. Everything that comes from the extractive sector, they save it, they invest it in different financial markets. The interest they use they include it in their annual budget to augment their other revenues of the government. But the base is just there invested in various markets. So lumalaki lang siya. And in times of need, they have money that they can use. So right now, it's not even the fund that they're touching. It's just the interest, and it's enough. But Norway has around 5 million people, but they have that money to support, to subsidize the needs of the unemployed, the individuals that are affected by COVID. So yun yung kanilang ginagamit na source ng ayuda. So good financial management of the proceeds from the extractive sector is very important. So the other thing that Gelson asked is on the fiscal policy, which I think you want me to focus on, right? So, and he mentioned a paper. So this one I want to share screen if possible, because this one I will show some numbers in terms of evaluating the fiscal policy. So kanina, pinag-uusapan natin, how much are we getting in terms of the extractive sector? Focus on macro data. And I said, it's actually very tricky to use that in evaluating the sector, because what we want is greater share from the revenue. So example, meron kang business, pumasok ka sa business.
Hello.
Yes.
Just to interrupt you, if you could enlarge your screen. Zoom in.
It's not. How about yan? Can you see it?
Okay, I think that
wait.
works.
There. Okay.
Better.
Yeah. So it's like entering into a business. What you want, if you're own, let's say you have a property and then you're renting it, you want to set some requirements. So pagka nagka-profit na yung business nyo, how much will I get as an owner of the asset or the land, right? So essentially, when we are evaluating each company, we want to look at the effective tax rate. So what does that mean? We're looking at how much we're getting from the share in profit of the mining companies through all the taxes that we impose to the companies. So here, this is before the changes in the excise tax and the corporate income tax. We look at we used various prices of these three minerals, and we estimated how much we get as a share of the profit. So here we have the 2% excise tax and we have the 30% corporate income tax. And when the prices are high, the most that we get is around 30%. Right? What if we increase the excise to 4%? So there was a time when the law was amended and excise tax was increased to 4%. And this was the impact. So still around when price is low, our effective tax rate is around 41%, but when prices are high, our effective tax rate is around 36%, 34 to 36%, so average of 35%. We amended we have a 5% royalty in some areas. So sa Mining Act natin, when it's mineral reservation, you impose additional 5% royalty. So when we have 5% royalty, the highest that we get is 44%. So it ranges from 40 to 45%, average of 43%. So so from the 100% profit, ito yung nakukuha ng Pilipinas, yung 58 to 60% yung napupunta sa company. We reduced the tax. Remember we had the recent reform and we reduced the corporate income tax 25%. So balik tayo sa around 40%. So in effect, with all those tax changes, I can send these slides to Gelson. It's also in the paper that he was referring to, that which I can also share kung wala pa yung iba. But in effect, what we are seeing is more or less we're back to where we were. 1990, effectively, the 1995 Mining Act, before we changed the excise tax. and before we change the corporate income tax. So essentially the change in corporate income tax and the increase in the excise tax augmented each other more or less. So yun yung nangyayari. So I think that's a big question that Bangsamoro has to think about. There was a study in the 90s that compared our effective tax rate to other countries. And in that study, it shows that we are one of the lowest in the world. From the 90s, the taxation in the world has evolved, but countries have moved to higher taxation in this sector because they want to get more. So the question is, if you are the owner of a resource, what percent would you be more comfortable with as a share of that profit, right? If you're gonna ask me, I'd be comfortable getting 50 to 60% share. The thing is, you cannot get 80% or higher because you also have to consider the risks that companies are internalizing when they enter into the business, and the capitalization and the expense. Remember when I mentioned that the contracting process in the Philippines is a first come first serve basis, because we don't have a sufficient or complete knowledge, or at least a comprehensive knowledge of the sector. And that also assumes that the company who will get the contract will assume the risks of extraction. So if the government is willing to share the risk, or would have greater investment in the sector, like knowing how much would be a deposit in the area, that would also reduce the risk of the companies. And sharing the risk can also mean greater share in profit. So there are many considerations, balancing act that we have to do in terms of making sure that we get what we think would be fair for the country. So I would stop there. I think I've answered most of Gelson's question. If there are other pending questions that I wasn't able to answer, I'd be happy to respond later in the discussion panel. Tama ba, Gelson?
Yes, but maybe before I let you out for now, I think there are some questions also coming from those in attendance, especially about. It's good that you have mentioned the different models for the average excise tax rates. But there's also a question about whether or not you increase the tax rate. There's also a question about the tax administration. Yes, you may increase the tax rate, but it's also a question about the tax administration. That's number one. And for those communities that ought to have a share of the revenue proceeds, there's also a question about what's the formula that you're using for revenue sharing in the revenue allocation. I know that this is outside the question that I asked you, but I think
Yeah.
they're quite related on the fiscal side of mining. Could you quickly comment on that, please?
Yes. So in the Philippines, if I remember correctly, in the era sharing is 60 not era, but it's the national wealth is also 60-40, and there's a way to divide it between the provinces, municipalities, cities, and the barangays that are hosting the extractive sector. I think the important point here is when you formulate what kind of tax you're imposing, again, Gelson is correct, you have to consider the capacity for tax administration. So ideally, so when, as I said, when you're evaluating the sector, you have the average effective tax rate, right? So you just gather all the proceeds from the various taxes, and you check how much these total taxes are vis-a-vis the profit. But then from a government perspective, various taxes have different roles. So there's a tax that's considered part of a share because you are the owner. There's a tax that we regularly impose, and we impose this in all the businesses that operate in the area, which is your corporate income tax. There's an excise tax that you impose because they produce externality. So you also impose excise tax on tobacco. So there's a unique tax that you collect because they're extractive sector. Then that's your royalty. So how you will compute the royalty, how you will compute the windfall tax, how you will compute the share would also take into consideration your tax administration capacity and your monitoring capacity. If you have the capacity to really monitor profit, check the revenue, check the value of the minerals in and out of the country, and then you can develop a tax that can be based on profit, right? So it's actually more progressive because it takes into account the fluctuation of the prices of minerals globally. If you have limited power in terms, or at least capacity in terms of monitoring, that's some governments would consider taxing based on just total revenue. Okay, so those are considerations that you can look at when formulating your fiscal framework for the sector.
The administering admissions to your college, so I know that you are juggling from here to that part. But I know that we are being joined in Zoom by members of the parliament that are also involved in the revenue code discussion, and we're also joined by the directors and other staff of MENRE and other executive offices in Bangsamoro. That's good. And we're also being viewed live on Facebook. So that's good. So I hope that you could join us in the panel discussion later, because I can sense that there are already questions that will be directed to you later. So thanks for now. So the next speaker is, yes, he's a friend of Sheila and mine too. He is my former colleague at NRGI. But I think that he used to be the Latin America director and then advisor for natural resource governance, and then an advisor now for the Ministry of Finance in Peru. He's joining us from Lima at it's 8:38 in the evening now. So Carlos is going to pick up from what Sheila has already started, but it's going to broaden the discussion a bit by providing the experience from Peru and others. And I think he'll provide a little bit of some kind of a lecture also of what a good mining fiscal policy should be. So over to you, Dr. Carlos Monge.
Thank you very much, Gelson. Good to see you. Good to see Cielo. We've met in different moments and spaces regarding these same issues along the years, and I hope we continue to do so. Thank you to the organizers of the meeting, the authorities, the EIG, and of course Bantay Kita, and I hope this helps. Are you going to scroll the presentation? Do you want me to share it on the screen?
Yeah, it's now being flashed on your screen.
Okay.
Anj?
Sorry, having technical difficulties.
Should I try to share it, Gelson?
Yeah, you can try. I think you should be given the co-host access. Yeah, all right, that's good. So it's being flashed now.
Is that good? Can you see it?
Yes, if you could use the slideshow.
Yes. Okay, so to make the best use of the time, I have tried to respond to two basic questions. The question about how much taxes and royalties should companies pay? I mean, whether it's a fair fiscal system that it's good for the country and also good for the companies. Theoretically, that should be a win-win situation. And the second big question is how do you use the fiscal rents that are generated by the payments by company? And the first general response is that there is no commonly accepted recipe for this. There's a huge variety across the world and across different regions and even within countries that have a more federal or more decentralized structure regarding how much taxes and royalties you charge and how do you allocate and use them. Let's go first to taxes and royalties. In the case of Peru, this is a chart for Peru. One important thing to notice is that for countries in which mining taxes and royalties are important, for mining countries, that is, such as Peru and maybe also Chile and Mexico and Brazil and others in Argentina, in my region in Latin America, there is the question of volatility. the incomes generated by these extractive sectors, and the same is for oil, are heavily correlated with the evolution of demand and prices in the international markets. And in turn, this demand and these prices are hardly volatile. They are not stable in time. Therefore, if you depend a lot on these resources, then it's very difficult to plan ahead, because you never know how much money, how much rent is coming in for the government or for the subnational governments. This graph is just an illustration of the case in Peru since 2005 to the present. No? Now, in Peru, we have a very interesting ongoing debate about tax reform in the mining sector. The idea is that Peru's tax pressure is very, very low. It's way below the regional average, and it's much way below the OECD standards for average, this group of institutions to which my country is trying to be incorporated. No? Particularly Peru's mining fiscal regime is pretty competitive comparing it to other mining countries in the world and in the region. So in this context, and I would also add, in a situation in which we have spent a massive amount of fiscal resources in the response to the pandemic, to COVID-19, no? In the forms of bonuses, helps out, cheap credit, or whatever, to keep the economy running and to keep people being able to survive and consume, because we have a huge recession as a result of our quarantines. We need money. We need to replenish our reserves, and we need money to pump up social investments, especially in the health sector. No? And so in this context, it's not just a theoretical thing that our tax pressure is way too low for the kind of country that we are, but it's also an urgent need for increased resources to continue responding to the challenges posed by the pandemic. No? In that context, the IMF has provided the Ministry of Economy and Finance of Peru with technical assistance to discuss the possibility of a tax reform, a general tax reform, but a specific tax reform in the mining sector. And the IMF, which you will understand is not a leftist NGO which is out to ruin the mining companies, considers that Peru could increase its tax pressure by 4 points without losing its competitive edge compared, for example, with Chile, which is our neighbor, which is the first producer of copper. Peru is the second, no? And which is the country with which we usually compare ourselves to see how are we doing regarding these matters, no? So there's room for a tax reform in Peru, according to the studies by the IMF. And there is some data there to illustrate it. I will not stop in that, but on the left, you can see the tax pressure. On the right, you can see where it says Peru Vigente, which is Peru current, that we are way below a number of other countries with which we compete. Also, the IMF is recommending that we can hike taxes in Peru without losing our capacity to attract investments compared to Chile or even now Ecuador and Colombia, who are pushing to open up their own copper frontier. No? Now, there is a debate around this. No, of course, as you can imagine, the mining companies oppose, and they have two basic arguments. One is that investors will not come because we will not offer them conditions that assure their expected profits. Investors are not out there to benefit nobody, they are out to make money. And if they don't get the kind of profit or gain level that they expect, then they will invest somewhere else. The other argument is that there are other countries that offer better tax conditions, and therefore, if we hike our taxes, investors will go somewhere else where they can actually meet their own expectations regarding profits against their investments. Nevertheless, the argument of the IMF, of the World Bank, was also looked at as a potential reform, and others is that there will be such a demand and such high prices for copper, in this case, which is the illustration that I made, but also for gold and other metals, as a result of the global energy transition, that most probably, even if you raise the taxes, companies will make bundles of money in the next mining cycle. Some people talk about a new super cycle, no? And therefore, these are fears that have no empirical grounds, but are mostly the resistance, the normal, natural resistance of companies to pay more taxes, which is absolutely natural. But the point is that estimates from the World Bank and the IMF says that that shouldn't be a problem, that companies will continue investing and will continue making handsome profits, and that governments have the right to try to obtain a better share, a higher share of what are called these windfall profit taxes in times of super cycles. No? By the way, I should also add that Chile has now elected a leftist government that has its own proposal for tax reform, and it's also looking at hiking up the taxes in the mining sector, especially for copper. I have to insist that they are the largest copper producers in the world. And so the IMF report for Peru was made before this announcement, before this happened. So in Peru, if Chile hikes its own taxing system, its own taxing rates, Peru would even have more fiscal room to increase our own taxes. So there will be even more space for a mining sector tax reform in Peru. No, that's the ongoing debate. Now, there is a conceptual problem behind the whole question of competitiveness. I mean, at the bottom of this discussion of how much should we tax the companies, there's always the idea that we are competing with other countries to attract investments, and that should be the key element to be taken into account to define our own tax rates, no? And the problem is that following that logic, what can happen is that countries engage in race to the bottom policies, no? By which they compete with each other, no, to attract investments by lowering their fiscal and also environmental and social standards. No? So this is a real problem. It's not a theoretical problem. This already happened after that last mining super cycle, mineral super cycle. After that 2002, 2011, 12 of super high demand and prices associated with very high growth rates in China, when prices and demand started to decline, especially prices in 2012, 13, 14, then companies in Latin America started to press governments to lower fiscal, environmental, and social standards, saying before, with the amount of money that we were making, we could cope with that, no? We could handle that. But now that we are making lesser money, if you want us to carry on, then we need to soften standards to make it easier to get permits, no? To weaken environmental procedures and to weaken civil society consultations, to weaken free, prior, and informed consent, no? Which Sheila Magno has referred to. So we saw a race to the bottom. That has been discussed, documented, and RGI was heavily involved in that discussion in Latin America. No? Now, the response to that is that actually countries and territories within countries, when that is the case, should not compete by lowering fiscal, environmental, and social standards. If they want to compete in order to attract investments, they should compete on the basis of the quality of the mineral deposits, of the quality of their labor force, and on the existence of positive economic externalities, such as access to energy, transport infrastructure, ports, and whatnot, no? So there was always will be some competition, of course, no? But it shouldn't be a race to the bottom approach to this competition, because it hurts countries. We don't get the money that we deserve to get when our resources are exploited. We destroy the ecosystems in which mining takes place, and we denied people consultation and participatory rights. And that's no way to compete. I would add, this is not written in the slide, that recently there was an initial contact between Peru and Chile authorities, the new elected people in Chile and the already elected government in Peru, to see if we could start a process of negotiating common standards, fiscal, environmental, and social common standards, to avoid race to the bottom competition, no? And we have asked ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America and Caribbean, to play a role in terms of bringing mining countries together and discussing these possibilities, to have then a shared platform of fiscal, environmental, and social standards, and find other ways to compete, but not to lower the standards that I have just mentioned. That's just a possibility. I hope it works. It would be, I think, a unique experience, and let's see about that, no? But that's an issue that I wanted to raise, no? Now, regarding the use of the fiscal rents, no? Again, no, there is no one recipe. There's no shoe that fits all, no? We have produced at NRGI a report for the Ford Foundation, which is not public, it was just a report for the Ford Foundation, reviewing 16 countries and looking at the literature on the matter, and we found 8 ways, 8 kinds of arrangements of rent allocation that you have listed on the left, and that you have in detail in the table, in the chart on the right. So I won't go into details, but the point is that there are very many ways in which countries respond to the challenge of allocation and use of these monies. And in a lot of cases, there is a combination. It's not that you have 1 or 2. Maybe you have 1 and 2 and 3 and maybe 5 or 6 and whatnot, no? In the case of Peru, it is basically that 50% of the income tax paid by the mining companies is kept by the central government, goes into the general budget, and then nobody can identify what happens to that. But the other 50% goes to regional, provincial, and district level governments, following the arrangement that is detailed there in the chart. Oops, I'm sorry, the numbers, the percentages don't appear in the chart. I will fix it and send it again. But 10% of that 50% goes to the producing district, 25% to the producing province and all its districts, 40% to all the provinces in the region, and then 25% to the regional government, out of which 1/5 goes to the national university. So that's the way the 50% of income tax that is given back. In Peru, taxes are collected by the central government, but in this case, 50% of the income tax paid by companies is given back to the regional, to the territory in which the mining activity takes place, in this case to the region, no, which is our largest subnational unit, and within the region is distributed according to those figures that I just presented. No? That's regarding the allocation. Regarding the use of these rents, the law says it can only be used for capital expenditures and not for current expenses. So it shouldn't cover salaries and whatnot, no? Data shows that in Peru, as well as in Colombia, Bolivia, and we have looked at that in a comparative fashion, most of the money is spent in transportation, health, and education sectors, infrastructure in those sectors, no? And also part of the money can be used for pre-investment expenses. I mean, you need to hire someone to prepare the project for which you're going to use these monies. And then an increasing chunk of the money is being used for maintenance, because once you build a road, you need to take care of that road. So now this precept that it should be used only for capital expenses doesn't hold 100%, because it's there have been these two openings, no? Pre-investment expenses and then maintenance, no? But that's the general idea in the case of Peru. And there is an open debate, an ongoing debate that has been taking place, I would say, for the last 20 years since these arrangements were put in place, no? The question of impact, no? And I'm going to add some stuff that is not written, and then I'm going to put it in writing and share it again for you guys to take a look at it if you want to, no? First, data shows that there is no direct correlation between abundance of mining rents and developmental performance, meaning growth or poverty alleviation or whatever other indicator, no? So you look at the data for the last 20 years of territories in which there is intense mining, and therefore they have a lot of money because they get 50% of the income tax. And then you look at territories that have no mining at all and no oil at all, and performance is the same. If, in the case of Peru, at least, the two leading regions in terms of growth and poverty alleviation and quality of life do not produce any mineral or any gas or oil or coal. No, their growth and well-being is based completely on renewable resources, no, and other activities. So that's an interesting debate, no? So much discussion, debate, fights, discrepancy around whom to give the rent and this and that, and the end result is that it really doesn't matter very much from the viewpoint of the growth and poverty and other indicators, no? I would say that on the other side, still on impact, and I will add that to the presentation, you have a question of corruption. I mean, this sudden abundance of money in very poor territories in which usually there were very small resources available, and you don't have the control mechanisms. The central state doesn't have the way to control the way things are done, and blah, blah, blah. You have an increased level of corruption in these resource-rich territories, and you have an increased level of conflict. Because suddenly, in very poor territories, the local government has a huge pot of money, no? And that becomes a source of conflict, no? Social conflict, political instability, and whatnot, no? So these are manifestations, of course, of the resource curse, no? In its classic definition, there is not only that you grow less, but also you have a lot of institutional problems associated with that conflict and whatnot, no? So there's an open debate regarding what is the point of having this kind of allocation scheme if there are no good results coming out of it. The second, there's a discussion on allocation itself, no? There is a subtle discussion about allocating money to non-producing regions, which is something, for example, that is done in Bolivia and in Colombia. In Colombia, the mechanism is that producing regions receive more, but non-producing regions receive some. In the case of Peru, producing regions receive 50% of the income tax they generate, but non-producing regions receive nothing. So in many cases, you have non-producing regions complaining about this because they say it's not that the people in those regions own the resources. The resources are owned by the nation, and therefore there should be a fair allocation of the resources, including non-producing regions. No? But the most intense debate is the idea, and this has been discussed in the Congress these days, that monies should not be given only to elected authorities, meaning regional authorities, provincial level authorities, or district level authorities, as this graph or this data shows, no? But also money should be given directly to local social organizations, no? In the case of Peru, it's mostly peasant communities and indigenous people's communities, grassroots organizations, no? And the argument is that elected officials, as municipalities at the district and province level, are usually corrupt and inefficient, and people directly impacted by the mining activity are not perceiving the benefits and are only perceiving the costs, the social and environmental impacts, no, of mining activity. And so mining companies are putting a lot of pressure behind this idea of direct transfers, because for them it's a question of legitimacy. They think that this is a way to appease a social conflict and have a more stable social and political environment to operate, no? Of course, this is not based on an assessment of what has gone wrong in the allocation of monies to the local municipalities. And so one could think, well, if local municipalities have problems handling these monies, imagine, no, the problems that are going to be faced by local social organizations that do not have an accountant, do not have a bank record, are not incorporated into the financial services. But that's what is being debated, I would say, more in a mix of company interest to gain legitimacy and congresspersons' interest to get legitimacy through populist measures. No, now we'll give you the money directly. Now, this happens elsewhere. In Bolivia, an important part of the hydrocarbon rent is used to fund cash transfer arrangements. So you have a pension fund for everybody who is over 60. You have a child support fund that goes to everybody who has children up to the age of 12, if I believe. And then you have a specific fund that are allocated to women who have children under school age or are pregnant. Those are three cash transfer mechanisms that are funded by especially oil and gas rents, no? So this idea of giving it directly to the people, in the case of Peru, to the local communities, in the case of Bolivia, to the individuals, I mean, it's not new, it happens in Bolivia, no? And some people praise it because you avoid the corruption and the inefficiency and the bureaucratic complications of subnational governments. Some others, including myself, say, okay, but then you don't build any kind of institution, no? You're bypassing institutions because they are inefficient or corrupt, but you are not making an effort to fix that. You're just saying, okay, let's take the shortcut and give it out to the people, and people will know how to use it in the best possible way, no? That's an open debate, and it's a very interesting one, no? And regarding the use of the monies, no? In the case of Peru, there's no, I mean, apart from the already mentioned restriction that it should be used for capital expenditures and not current expenditures, there's no other consideration, no? But we have tried before in Peru to open up a discussion regarding other possible uses, no? For example, allocate the monies to the poorer areas and use it to close poverty gaps, or allocate the resources to areas in which the gender gap is bigger and try to close it, or allocated to the regions and territories that are facing stronger environmental challenges resulting from global warming, no? And we have done the exercise for a number of countries, and this is the one for Peru, no? In which in map 3, you can see the current allocation, and the darker territories are the ones that receive more money because they have a more intense mining activity there, no? But then you can see, no, In map, I think it's 5. No, the one at top of right, I cannot see the number in my screen because it's blocked by other stuff. No, in which you can see if the allocation is based on poverty. It changes. No, it moves from the mining territories to other territories, including the city of Lima. Peru is a highly centralized country. Lima has 1/3 of the population, and a lot of that population is very poor. So money would flow to the poorer territories. On map 6, you have an estimation based on the map of gender inequality. No, inequalities in terms of women, no, accessing to services and jobs and incomes and whatnot. No, poverty. And then you have, so the money will flow more to the eastern territories of the country, which is the Amazon basin, the jungles, no? And then on map 8, what if it was allocated on the basis, take into account the climate change risk map, because this is all being mapped in Peru, and then you have a completely different allocation, no? Recently, sorry, because that was actually the last slide, but let me add something. What I wanted to add is that recently there is an additional line of debate regarding the use of the money for economic diversification. I think Sheila Magno also mentioned this, no? It's not a good idea to depend on one single product. It's not a good idea to be a country that depends on oil or depends on one commodity such as minerals, because then you're subject to this volatility because it's a non-renewable resource and it doesn't generate a broader based growth and development and well-being. No? So now this is something that I have been discussing in the Ministry of Economy and Finance, no? How to find ways to use the mining rent to depend less on mining. This may sound as an oxymoron, as a contradiction in terms, but that's exactly the point. How can you use the rent that is generated by mining to diversify your economy so that you do not depend on the activity that is generating such a rent? No? That's a challenge. We have been discussing possibilities, whatever, to build infrastructure that is specifically targeted to open up markets for other products, no? To provide credits to upstarting economic activities that have nothing to do with the mining sector. I mean, they're there to provide capacity building, no? For producers, to provide technical assistance to people who are producing things that have nothing to do with mining. So I mean, to use the mining rate with the specific purpose, objective of becoming less dependent on mining, I think that's a critical thing to do. And a final thing is that I support very much, and this is a discussion in Chile, but now it's starting in Peru, this idea presented by Sheila Magno that now the environmental impact assessments should take into account not only the impact of the mining activity on the local ecosystem, but on climate. And that means the way an activity will contribute to the generation of greenhouse effect gases, but also the way an activity could contribute to aggravate, to worsen the impacts of global warming on those ecosystems in a country like Peru and Chile that has to do with water. I would leave it there. I will thank you again very much for the invitation, for the time, and I hope that this presentation has contributed to enlighten the debates and the issues we're dealing with in the Philippines. Thanks again.
With us for the Q&A. Maybe before I actually let you go for now, I have some question. I think which is quite relevant for Bangsamoro. And the context here is that unlike in the ARM days, under the Bangsamoro Organic Law, what is clear there is that the Bangsamoro government has the full responsibility in the management and the utilization of tax rents or revenues generated from mining. And that includes, of course, its responsibility in prescribing a tax rate, also administering the tax, as well as its role in allocating the revenues from mine. And this is something that's being considered in the discussion in the Bangsamoro Transition Authority, which is the parliament. But I think I want to connect that actually with your presentation about the Peruvian case, because you mentioned that there are several, the percentage of allocating the tax payment and how much goes to the central, to the regional, to the community, of course, is varied. And you mentioned also that there's no commonly accepted way to allocate extractive rents, but a lot of this can then go to the regional government, subnational governments, households, communities, and also in the communities. And this can also be allocated for use and utilization of the sovereign wealth fund. Perhaps this is an important part that needs to be linked with the case of the Bangsamoro, because in the past, some conflicts arose because of conflict over the resources. And in places where there has been conflicts over minerals, these are also places where you see the so-called, term, monetary poverty. Now, in the context of Peru, since you're quite involved in supporting regional government, subnational governments and communities in terms of asserting their space in determining how much of the revenue should go to community development fund and how this could be part of the local development budget planning. Has that kind of revenue allocation at the subnational and community level actually decreased monetary poverty? And has that also reduced any incidents of resource-based conflicts in Peru? Because that question might be relevant in the context of Bangsamoro.
Okay, thank you. Let me respond in the following way. First, in Latin America, the only country in which taxation is decided at a subnational level is Argentina. In Argentina, you have the central government and then you have the provinces. That's their second level government. And then of course you have the local municipalities. In Argentina, it is the province that decides the tax rate. And therefore provinces compete. Inside the country, they compete between each other, to attract mining investment. In the rest of Latin America, absolutely, it's the central government and usually the parliament, the national parliament, that decides on tax rates. It's not a decentralized decision. Okay, so that's, I would say, a significant difference with your experience. I mean, the only way would be to compare Philippines with the Argentinian experience. That would be interesting, sometime to get someone from Argentina to make a detailed presentation about the experience of having subnational taxation. In the rest of Latin America, as in Peru, the central government collects the taxes. The central government determines the tax rate, collects, and then transfers back. Okay. Now, once the money is transferred, at least in the case of Peru, the subnational government is absolutely free to use the money as it sees fit. The restriction is the one I mentioned. You cannot pay salaries, okay? You cannot hire more drivers for your office or more staff. You cannot even train your staff. You can build a school, you can build a road, you can build, and you can give it maintenance, year after year, but you cannot train a teacher because that's considered current expenditure. So that's the restriction. But within that restriction, a regional government or the provincial level government or the district level government Remember, we have 3 subnational levels of government: the region, the province, and the district. They can decide if they want to spend all the money in transportation and nothing on health and education infrastructure. That's okay. That's their call. No, there is no restriction regarding that. No, the challenge has been that we embarked. I mean, this is recent in Peru. It started in the 2000s, not 20 years ago. In 2002, we started a process of decentralization that included this legislation to decentralize extractive sector resources. No, these laws of allocation to producing regions are valid for minerals, for gas, for oil, for energy, and for fisheries and for forestry. So these 6 sectors are subject to these laws of decentralization of the fiscal incomes these sectors generate. And a huge problem has been that the questions, I would say, of capacities, the question of transparency and controls against corruption, and the question of civil society participation. No? In theory, this decentralization process and the allocation of these rents to subnational governments should have come with an intense process of capacity building and with a strengthening of transparency, no, and corruption control mechanisms, and with very strong civil society participatory mechanisms. But all that has not really worked. There has not been really a centralized, well-funded, no, politically motivated effort to do that. And to a large extent, what we have done was replicated all the problems we already had at the central government.
All right.
You have to remember that our last 5 presidents, 100% of our previous presidents are in jail in the US, ready to be extradited, killed himself in order to avoid going to jail, subject to fiscal investigations, detained in his house. So it's not that we had a national state that was fantastic and then corruption happened at the subnational level. No, no, no. Our decentralization translated to the subnational level resources, but all the limitations and problems of the central government. No? Finally, there's an open debate about funds. In Latin America, very few countries have resource-based funds, no? Like Norway, that was mentioned. No? Chile has an interesting arrangement. Chile uses one part of the copper rent to sustain its pension system, and the other to have a stabilization fund. Peru has a national stabilization fund, but it's not a resource-based fund. It's a general stabilization fund. No? On the other side, Trinidad and Tobago has a super complex, no, stabilization fund. And then, of course, you have the US examples in Alaska and the Canada one in Alberta, which combine cash transfers, no, with long-term investments and whatnot. We do not have that. And there's an open debate about the possibility of establishing them at the subnational level, so that in terms of abundance, the authority that receives the money, in the case of Peru, they face a problem. No? If you don't spend your money, then you have to give it back. So the pressure is to spend it in whatever, in order not to give it back.
Okay.
So there's no option to save it for the future. So that's an incentive for poor spending, poor quality spending. So that's an open debate, how to establish Norwegian type funds at the subnational level to allow these authorities to spend well, no, and to save monies in times of abundance, no, and then have those resources for times in which, because of volatility, the prices come down and you need the money to sustain a planned no, level of investment along the years. So that's an open debate.
Okay, thank you, Carlos. Lots to process there. I know that you mentioned about the establishment of the fund. It may be a new concept in the context of Bangsamoro discussion, but in the report we have already mentioned there the consideration to establish that wealth fund because there are many experiences as well in the neighboring countries, East Timor, Mongolia, and others that have tried to reinvest their share, the mining revenues into funds. But that's an open debate, and it can also hopefully be part of the conversation around broader revenue management beyond bringing it directly to the local government and communities. So, Carlos, please stay there. I also note that, apologies for the other speakers yet, but we need to make sure that we get some Dr. Sheila Magno, because I know that she is about to leave soon. There's actually a good question for you there, Sheila, from Dr. Cory Naz from the MICC Technical Review Team for BARMM. And she asked, if BARMM mining companies pay taxes such as excise taxes of their mineral production to the national government, and if the LGUs that host mining companies in BARMM receive their share of national wealth from mining from the national government. So that's the first question to you, Sheila. And also, before you leave, I just want you to again reiterate some of the key messages that you would like to impart to the BARMM leadership with regards to the fiscal mining policy, especially the revenue code discussion. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm free after this. You're letting me go. So I'm waiting for the panel also. If you need me to stay, I'll try to stay. On the question about on whether the BARMM provinces are getting their share of excise tax, from the national, ideally they should be getting it because that's what the law says. They should be getting their share of excise tax. I haven't seen yet. I have to confirm if that's actually what's going on. We can look at the EITI data because the EITI data should have those information on how much each province, each LGU is getting from the mining companies in their area. And that's the reason also why I'm advocating for subnational EITI, so that each subnational government can actually do their own monitoring, because sometimes at the national level you only look at macro figures. But if you're actually going to have subnational EITI, then there's a better mechanism to actually monitor each company. Hold on 1 minute. Sorry, I'm actually doing student advising. I'll just tell the student to just wait 1 minute.
Sure, but as you're doing that, I'll actually look at the EITI report that looks at the national allocation for BARMM in terms of their share. There was actually the provincial government received, the municipal government received, but it wasn't reconciled, and also how much went actually the communities. We don't have that data.
Yeah, so
It's
that's
from that 2018 report.
That's the gap. I think it will be good for subnational governments to actually demand that and demand the basis for computation so that you can validate. And that's the reason why also it's important to have subnational EITI, because at the subnational level you also have greater capacity to monitor how much of these minerals are being taken out. Kasi minsan it comes from our port directly to the other country's port, Japan or China. And the national government might have limited power to monitor that, or even capacity. So greater monitoring on the ground, knowing how much is being extracted, validating it and comparing with the EITI data will be very, very useful. And demanding for a better disaggregated data will also be very helpful, so that you know how much is the excise tax that was computed, how much is the royalty, and how much are you really getting. And there was a time even before EITI when LGUs cannot have no basis on what they will receive from the national government. It's so unpredictable. And it affects the public finance situation of the local government. It hinders long-term, medium-term planning, because you don't know how much money you're gonna get from the national government, diba? And sometimes they're delayed. So if we're monitoring this and we have better information, then it becomes more predictable and easier for local governments and subnational governments to plan for their budgeting process.
So on that note, please stay with us if you
Okay.
can. Yeah, because I'm pretty sure there will be additional questions for you. There's already one, okay? So stay there and
Yeah,
do your other stuff. Thank
I'm
you.
just here. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Carlos and Chelo, thank you so much. Now, there's a lot there to process for our audiences, which I think is exactly what's important. I hope that you get fired up, but still, we ask you to formulate your feedback and questions later. I would like to call now our representative from the EITI International Secretariat, uh, Attorney Brenda J. Angeles Mendoza, who is the country manager of for Asia at the EITI International Secretariat. She herself was very much involved in the production preparation of the EITI PH report. I think the first two, no? And she's also been from the mining industry as well, and she has done a number of consulting for Asian Development Bank and other think tank organizations. So I think this is where we need to ask her about, based on the earlier presentations by Sheila and Carlos, how important then is the open and accountable management of mining and I would say fiscal reporting in the resource-rich countries. And also, since EITI, the initiative per se, has been quite mentioned in terms of its importance, why do you think there are more countries that continue to support and becoming active member in the EITI initiative, considering there's a lot of data that needs to be disclosed, also the beneficial owners that many years ago, many governments and companies were quite allergic. But why is it that there's a greater uptake to it? Now, can you walk us through the process it has taken for many countries? In general, why they are supportive of this data disclosure? What's in it for them? And has that actually resulted not just in data disclosure, but has that actually resulted in the better management of their extractive resources and also the revenues also? And how does that? How many of these countries have actually been able to make use of the data to inform the development or reform of the mining law or even revenue policies? So those are the tough questions for you, Ms. Brenda. So over to you.
Okay, good morning, Gels. Good morning, everyone. So first, before I answer your three questions, and I have prepared just 3 slides for each of the questions that you sent me. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting the EITI International Secretariat. Although, as you mentioned, I have also been involved in the national implementation of EITI in the Philippines. No, I have read the BK reports. I would like to congratulate BK for that, and I have noted several references to the EITI. Okay, so with that, I will now focus on the 3 questions that you sent me. So first, on how important is open and accountable management of mining and other extractive resources. No? So, well, for the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, the open and accountable management of mining and other extractive resources is an important means of strengthening the governance of the public and corporate entities. No? It also is a means to promote understanding of natural resources management. And as have been mentioned in earlier in the session, EITI would provide data that could inform reforms for greater transparency and accountability in the extractive sector. EITI implements a set of global standards that promote open and accountable management of these resources. So the EITI standard requires disclosure of information along the extractive value chains, as you would see in the slide, the extractive value chain from the point of extraction to how revenues make their way through the government and how they benefit the public. So, for example, in the first part of this slide, there would be a disclosure of the what is really in there in a country, what are the natural resources that are found in a country. We also the standard also requires countries to disclose contracts and licenses. So for example, model contracts, the beneficial owners, license data, and even the coordinates of these licenses. In terms of production, they are required to disclose production data, the volume of exports, the volume and value of production, etc. And then in terms of revenue allocation, what are the tax revenue schemes and mechanisms, sales by government and state-owned enterprises, etc. And of course, I think this would be of interest to everyone. The disclosure on revenue, how is revenue that is collected allocated? How are revenues managed? How are these revenues distributed? What are the mechanisms, if any, for subnational transfers and subnational payments? Also, the EAT standard requires countries to disclose figures on social and economic spending. So, for example, payments on in some countries, they disclose payments on corporate social responsibility activities of companies, quasi-fiscal expenditures, the contributions to the national economy. So they disclose employment and mining data, or even the connection between gender and employment in mining, and even environmental impacts and environmental payments. Of course, the public benefit. How does it tries to connect how the extraction and the exploitation and use of natural resources would ultimately result into a greater benefit for the public. So quite recently, the EITI is also exploring the what Dr. Sheila mentioned earlier, with the advent, of course, we have climate change, and we have now an ongoing transition in terms of energy resources, where there's an increased demand for renewable sources of energy. Now, EITI is studying how the probable consequent increase in the demand for critical minerals can actually be integrated into the EITI framework. So as part of that strengthening governance along this value chain. Okay. Now on the second question on why has there been a continued support for EITI from resource-rich governments, extractive companies, and civil society organizations? What's in it for them? And what has government participation achieved from EITI in terms of policy reform and institutional performance? Maybe on the second slide, please. Currently, just on data, we have there are now 56 countries that are implementing the EITI standard. There are about more than 60 companies. For example, Shell, BHP, Glencore, that are also supporting the EITI standard in areas, in countries where they are operating. And we have several CSO partners, for example, the Publish What You Pay, NRGI, Oxfam, Transparency International, and also about 800 plus national CSOs that are advocating for the implementation of the EITI standard. So, and it's increasing on an annual basis. So, what's in there? So I think there has been a continued support for EITI from resource-rich government and from all this, primarily because of the multi-stakeholder nature of the EITI, and that multi-stakeholder aspect of the EITI can be observed at all levels, at the country level, even in the international EITI board, in some of the committees, and slowly, gradually in the countries where we are implementing, there are now what we call EITI subnational committees that are supporting the standard. I think Chelsea has mentioned Mongolia. etc. So also there has been continued support also in terms of the outcomes and impact that EIT implementation has attained over the years. So you have the standard, which is being implemented by a multi-stakeholder group. So the EIT standard requires an effective multi-stakeholder oversight, including a working and a functioning multi-stakeholder group that involves the government, the companies, and the full independent, active, and effective participation of civil society. There's a particular protocol, it's called the Civil Society Protocol, that is also part of the standard. So, so you have there, when countries are validated, they are validated along this line. So for example, you look at stakeholder engagement. So it assesses the level and quality of participation of each of the constituencies, and the multi-stakeholder oversight throughout the EITA process, as I've mentioned earlier. Also, when countries are validated, it also assesses the different requirements, whether the country meets the disclosure requirements of the EITA standards. So I have mentioned earlier that the disclosure requirements across the entire value chain, from the point of extraction up to the point of social and environmental payments and impact, and of course on the public benefit. So that's also part of the transparency aspects of that is being assessed. And of course, the component on outcomes and impact assesses the progress of a country in addressing national priorities and contributing to that public debate. So, so all this combined, I think with multi-stakeholder participation, actually makes the EITI attractive and supported and sustained by many countries. So in terms of outcomes and impact, EITA stakeholders in different countries measure and understand the impact in different ways. For example, for some countries, they would see EITA as referring or looking at improved trust and less conflict, because there are greater opportunities for dialogue and constructive engagement among the three constituency groups. Then there would be a greater level of trust, lesser conflict, because they're able to have constructive discussions. For others, impact is about looking at and appreciating it's about growth, looking at what's the impact of all this on GDP, revenue generation. For others, it's about enacting or pushing for the enactment of stronger laws in their respective countries, and sanctioning non-reforming governments. So if you're an implementing country, some countries would are able to enact legislation pertaining to EITI or requiring companies to really to comply with the requirements of the EITI standard. There are provisions in the EITI standard on suspension and even corrective actions that can be undertaken when they are when the countries are not able to disclose according to the standards provided in the EITI. For other countries, it's about incremental opening of democratic space, and improved accountability of their government. So efforts on online reporting, increasing public access to extractive data, you have the beneficial ownership, disclosure and transparency, anti-corruption mechanisms. There are many other examples on that and how they regard the impact of the EITI. But in all cases, I think EITI is regarded as creating public good in a sense. On the second aspect of the question on the government's participation in EITI in terms of policy reform and institutional performance. In the Philippines, for example, the government is represented in the MSG or the multi-stakeholder group by different agencies, namely the Department of Finance, you have the DNR, Mines and Geosciences Bureau, the Department of Energy, DLG, and the ULAP or the Union of Local Authorities of the Philippines. So through their participation in the EITA process, although of course there are gaps as have been mentioned already still, no, but somehow to a certain extent, the government through the EAA process is able to show direct and indirect contribution of the extractive industry to the economy through GDP, revenue streams, employment data, exports. No? So that is already seen, for example, in the MGB public portal. We have the EITI, also the Philippine EAA portal, where there are resources that the public can view. It also facilitates reconciliation of company payments and government revenues, no, from the extractive industries, thus informing public debate about the governance of the industry. In other countries, government participation in the EAA process has led to the passage, as I mentioned earlier, of important laws and policies, regulatory framework, for example, making EAA mandatory, requiring disclosure of beneficial owners, their contracts, etc. No? It also led to the development of license allocation systems for some, license registers, reporting tools, no, where, for example, a disclosure reveals deficiencies in the licensing system. Stakeholders are able to use this information to push for reforms, no, to ensure more transparent licensing system, which in turn tend to enhance, no, investment climate. So, for example, they're able to discuss what criteria should be used in issuing the license, what's the process for awarding these licenses, and has there been any deviation from the legal framework or process on license allocation, etc. So I can mention a few country cases where of reports that led to reforms. For example, I did a bit of research just last night. Okay, so for example, in Nigeria, no, there was a time in the history of Nigeria where the government incentivized petroleum activities. So in order to incentivize petroleum activities, they lowered tax payments and royalty rates. However, in one of the EAA reports that Nigeria as an implementing country produced, the report showed massive losses of revenue for about 16 billion to about 28 billion US dollars. And because of the disclosure of that report, that information somehow led to the amendment of that law, the earlier law, and somehow it helped reform that the fiscal policy on that, and it strengthened tax administration in that respect. No? So they were able to use the EAA report in pushing for the enactment of better fiscal policy. Another one is on another example would be the Republic of Congo. In the Republic of Congo, 92% of the total revenue from the extractive activities, the extractive industry actually has 92% of that revenue. No? And one of the in the report, no, they mentioned that only 10%. No? The report cited that only 10% actually flows to the treasury, and it discovered that 90% actually was used to pay for to reimburse, no? Infrastructure loans and other reimbursement for other countries, no? So for China, for commodity traders, and also for the construction of a power plant. So because of that disclosure and that report, it opened a lot of avenues, no, for the stakeholders to somehow, especially the CSOs and the donor community, to scrutinize where is the revenue going. So they were able to determine where the money actually flows, and now they're able to require oil companies to make public those expenditures, so that it would be better directed towards social services, public infrastructure, fuel subsidies, and other and so forth. So it became an issue of or a matter of public interest that actually paved the way for the companies and the government to ask companies to become more transparent in their expenditure. And lastly, which is connected to the third question that Gelson sent, is on Madagascar. There was this extractive company that operates. I will not mention the name, but it's in the report. It is located in 2 regions and about 20 local areas or communes in Madagascar. And under their law, they're supposed to be the communes are supposed to be entitled to a share of the revenues from the company. So similar to other countries, Madagascar is supposed to receive that share, in order to mitigate the impact of hosting extractive activities and also to contribute to local development. So there has to be transparency in these transfers. With the report, they are able to somehow there was a push to disclose this and to actually push for a regulation that would push for a regulation. There was also a debate on how can this be disclosed and how could this really be tracked by local communities. And there are other examples of this. Also, all these countries would say that making this revenue information more public can actually do a lot of things for the government, for the country. So I think for the government, they're able to they can actually use this data to institute reforms, fiscal reforms, and so forth. Now, for the companies, it's also a way of not only when they share disclosure information, it's also when the public knows that they disclose information, it can also be they can have this social license to operate, and they're also able to comply with international best practices on extractive activities. And for of course, for the CSOs, they're able to actively participate in the process and use the EIT data for their own advocacy, to push for reforms, to push for initiatives that would really enable local communities and the greater public to benefit from extractive activities. All right, so that's I think for the second question. Now, on the third one, can an autonomous government of the Bangsamoro region benefit from EITI, and can it offer robust yet practical standards to improve mining taxation and revenue sharing system? I would say, of course, definitely yes. EITI is based on the principle that a public understanding of government revenues and expenditure over time could help public debate and informed choice of appropriate and realistic options for sustainable development. So as I mentioned earlier, the EITI requires a reconciliation of company payments and government revenues from the extractive industries. And this principle can be adapted in the BARMM context. I'm showing this slide because in some countries, sorry, extractive companies make direct payments to subnational government entities, such as regional governments, municipalities, and in other countries, fiefdoms. So here we have, of course, regional governments and local government units. And also some governments have revenue sharing mechanisms, and we also have the same mechanism here that stipulated a share of revenues collected by the central government is transferred to subnational government entities. Okay, so while these payments may represent only a portion of revenues at the national level, which is reported, they're often an important source of income for local governments. So transparency regarding these payments and transfers can be very useful in holding local authorities to account. So EIT implementation has shown a strong demand from local communities now to increase transparency around the allocation of such revenues, to ensure that revenues contribute to sustainable local development. No, in several countries, EIT report has led to changes in the applicable regulatory framework and help local communities demand the share of revenues they're entitled to. So as Dr. Sheila mentioned earlier, it's really very incumbent upon local communities to really demand. If this is not happening in a country at the local level, then the presence of different stakeholders can actually push for that, that the share of revenues are actually received. The revenues that they are entitled to are actually received by local communities, the host communities. And also, EIT implementation can help local governments and the BARMM not track, manage, and disclose revenues more efficiently. Of course, the EITI has guidance on that, and I think what I'm showing you is the guidance that we are implementing. So one is we call it subnational payments. This provides guidance on direct payments by companies to subnational entities. So it is the EITI standard requires that where these are material, direct company payments to subnational government entities and the receipts of these payments are disclosed and reconciled. Also for subnational transfers, EITA standard also provides guidance on transfers of revenues between central and subnational levels of government, where the company pays directly to the central government, and the central government in turn transfers those share or a portion of that revenue to the local government units. So I think in closing, I think it would the EIT standard, the framework can be adapted in BARMM context, and as you are discussing reforms in your fiscal regime and the mining code, I think it would be important to look at the experience of some countries. We have a website that you can refer to, but in terms of the principles, in terms of the framework, you can actually learn from the multi-stakeholder aspect of governance of the EITI, and you can look at the different models on how this can be disclosed, this can be accessed, is how this can be used for different purposes. It can really be a good portal. The data can actually be used for different, for multiple use, for different stakeholders. So that's it. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Attorney Brenda. Very quickly, I know yesterday, Mr. Eastwood from the PHEITI mentioned that engagement with Bangsamoro, particularly with MENRE, is already in their work plan. So I'd like to assume that some of the points that you have raised would be part of the continuing discussion that they will have moving from this discussion. There's a lot there, and I'd like to assume that some other participants also hopefully are not so overwhelmed with the data that you presented, but certainly these are points that hopefully could be absorbed in further discussion. But there's 3 points here without repeating what you've been said, what you've said. It's about the role of the EITI in convening multi-stakeholders. And I think, in a way, this speaks to the point raised yesterday about the inclusion of civil society and community. Because in the past, before the EITI, there has been a lot of tension between stakeholders, either companies or civil society that are allergic to each other, or they just come from different points of view. And to a large extent, because of the multi-stakeholder platform that is required in the EITI, you got these people who are not talking in the past that are already talking and talking about common goal, which includes, among other things, disclosure, transparency. And I think it got them to many things, including discussion about, not just disclosure, but also the importance of improving the management and revenue sharing. And there has also been a great uptake from the local government units as well, and also the participation of the indigenous people. So certainly these are things that will be considered when the Bangsamoro government would eventually participate in the EITI process. No? It might look taxing at first, but once you get into it, it becomes like a very good system. You mentioned also about the experience of DRC and Nigeria, although they are quite far from here. But I think some of the commonalities are that these countries have also undergone a series of fragility, conflict, and violence, in that resource conflicts, especially in oil and gas, are very much part of those transitions also. And although the topic today is about mining, you spoke about the oil and gas or the petroleum industries of this country. I'd like to think that this can hopefully be part of the discussion also in terms of the participation of the EITI, which is limited to mining, but also on oil and gas. This is an area which was not covered by the report, but certainly it's an equally important topic to be discussed along the way, because there's separate discussion on energy, the role of Liguas on Mars, and others. I'm not going to raise that part of the discussion because that's big, no? So I think that's good. Please stay with us for the discussion. I know that our panel reactors now are quite ready to share their feedback. So in order of, shall we go to Attorney Ishak first? I understand that he is ready. Now, there are also questions in Zoom and in live that we will call you later, including Mr. Chito. I know that you are rearing to ask questions, but I will call your name later. Now, so shall we then begin with the reaction from Attorney Ishak Mastura, who himself has specialized in his master's on oil and gas, has written a report, actually an analysis on the mining, oil and gas from a fiscal, a regulatory perspective. It would be good to share, for him to share his thoughts also. And he's the current chairperson of the BARMM Bureau of Investment. He has held that position also even before BARMM. So over to you, Attorney Ishak. It's good to have you engaged, because you actually participated in the first workshop that we held in 2018. So it's good to have you back.
Thank you, Paul. Yes. So I was here also yesterday in the Zoom meeting natin, and I heard all the presentations, as well as I read your report. So ang sa akin lang is the overall framework, because yung mga issues na napag-usapan kahapon pa and today, basically nahimay niyo na, no? So as a lawyer, also having some expertise on mining as well as energy law, no, I was my master of laws was in University of Dundee sa Center for Energy, Petroleum and Mineral Law and Policy. At yun yung natatakel namin doon is the framework for mining energy, including yung policies, no? Hindi lang yung law. It's very important kasi yung policies. So I've been in the BARMM for quite some time, since ARM pa, no? I've rendered siguro ngayon by this time 20 years of service and in the BARMM, and I very well know yung autonomous setup, the autonomous setup that we have here. And the BOL, I was part of those in the legal panel who worked in the drafting, as well as during the negotiations, the framework agreement on the Bangsamoro, comprehensive agreement on the Bangsamoro. So the biggest issue right now for the framework natin sa BARMM is that the emphasis on the mining framework being subject to national laws. If you read the BOL, it's very clear there that these are all subject to national laws and the Constitution. That's why during the ARM days, it was not so much of a problem because we had devolution. So the powers that were given to the ARM were quite clear that it is by devolution. So there's an enumeration of the powers that are being granted to the BARMM through that process of devolution. Now, when we have this set up right now under the ball. I'm looking at the the BOL. No, it says here in section 13 in the Article 13, Regional Economy and Patrimony on Mines and Mineral Resources, subject to the provisions of the Constitution and national laws, the Bangsamoro government shall have authority and jurisdiction over exploration, development, utilization, mines, minerals, territorial jurisdiction, taking into consideration environmental protection and ecological balance. The Bangsamoro government shall have the power to grant permits, licenses, contracts for this purpose. Just by being subject to national law, we are already constrained into the framework of what kind of licenses, licensing arrangements, permits, franchising that we can engage in. That's why we cannot deviate, for example, from the mineral production sharing contract as defined by national law, or the FTA, much more the FTA, because it needs the signature of the president. So as long as we are constrained by that, we can only improve the standards. We can make the standards of good governance standards in terms of giving the licenses, the concessions. We can improve that, but basically we have to follow the outlines of that national law. So our autonomy is constrained, in particular with regard to mines and minerals. Unlike, for example, other aspects of the BOL, this provision is very specific to mines and minerals. That's the difference. While we can have a general color of authority with regard to other powers and jurisdictions of the BARMM, because they're in general in terms of expression or statement in the BOL, in this case is very specific, and it is in reference to mines and minerals. That's why I think you see the phenomenon of the what do you call that, MICC, the body that is now doing the audit for the mines in the Bangsamoro, that they have come into the picture actually, and it's their mandate now to make sure that we are complying with those standards of the national government. So even if we make a law, for example, the mining code, which was the discussion here for quite some time, it has to hew to the framework, to the outline of the national law. So otherwise, the grant or the license that is given to the investor, I'm also the Regional Bangsamoro Board of Investments, and we've dealt with some of the mining companies who have applied for us for fiscal incentives, in particular limited to the duty-free importation of capital equipment. And we have seen that the leeway that is given to us is quite narrow in terms of determining a form of license or a form of grant to the mining companies. And I've heard from the miners in the BARMM that it's already restrictive enough, so we can only tweak tweak it, but ultimately what determines policies in mines and minerals would be the national laws. So that's the real issue here. And of course, now we have the Intergovernmental Relations Board. We can discuss, for example, what are the parameters of that kind of engagement. Otherwise, there's every chance that national government will keep on intruding into the mines and minerals policy.
Thank you, Attorney Ishak. Did you just make a pause? Or yeah.
Yes, go.
Do you have anything else to say?
Basically, that's it. For me, the framework is the most important.
Yeah. Thank you, Attorney Ishak. I've actually read your report, and we somehow use that to inform the analysis in the report. So I think again, you mentioned about that we are being constrained by the national law. But so we can only improve the standards, but a lot of this will still have to be subject to national law. And maybe a question, an immediate question to you is two things. One, with the Intergovernmental Relations Board, is that the only forum that you think this issue of ownership or who has the greater responsibility in improving the law and determining the revenue system Is that the only forum available for Bangsamoro government to discuss those specific policy issues in BARMM? That's number one. Number two, is there a way in which the Bangsamoro government can be more assertive in terms of the greater responsibility with respect to the issue of policy? Thanks.
Very good question. Actually, IGR is not limited to the Intergovernmental Relations Board. We also have the Intergovernmental Relations Energy Board and also the Sustainable Development Board. So all those are forums for discussions between the national government and the regional government. But IGR in its essence is actually interpersonal relations. So if we have good interpersonal relations with the national government, that's already intergovernmental relations. It can also be bilateral between our ministry and the DNR, for example, then or the MGB, then we can work on a bilateral basis. It's not limited to the to the IGR. The IGR is, for the most part, is viewed as a conflict resolution mechanism. But even then, that IGR is not in a very well, how would I put it? It's not very well established because, in fact, the IGR is a mere memo from the executive secretary assigning the Department of Finance to chair the Intergovernmental Relations Board in conjunction or with the BARMM government as also the having its own chair. So the Department of Finance is the co-chair of the IGR. But so it's a very loose arrangement. If it's just a memo from the executive secretary, the next president can change the structure, can change that mechanism. So that's one area of improvement. We can put the IGR mechanism into a more stable and more stronger legal footing, so that actually it resolves issues. Because if you look at the ball, ultimately after the IGR conflicts or if there are conflicts or there are issues, it can be resolved through the president. The president ultimately, that's where the buck stops. So your question with regard to how we can improve and make things move faster and at the same time improve the governance, it's not just the IGR. At the end of the day, there's also the other side. That's why I emphasize that after the IGR, you go to the president. There's also the general supervision of the president over the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao. And that's needed power of oversight. And meaning, unfortunately also, everything stops at the president's table with regard to policies, because he's the one implementing executive policies in the executive department. So in this case, the BARMM as a form of local government unit, which the Supreme Court in many instances in jurisprudence has pronounced very clearly that it's a form of local government unit. And our constitution itself says that the BARMM as a local government unit is under the general supervision to ensure that laws are properly implemented. Then it means that we have that channel as well. And of course, we know the president works through alter egos. So the alter egos are the secretaries. So we have to have good relations with the individual agencies or ministries or other departments in the national government, so that we can enforce at the same time police, at the same time implement the policies that are needed in the BARMM with regard to mines and minerals. That's why there's no surprise, for example, why we have not been able to exploit our energy resources, the oil and gas in the Liguasan as well as in the Sudu Sea, because we don't have that policy framework yet. We need the government, national government, as the driver, because up to what extent are they willing to concede some areas in terms of policy, in terms of process, procedure, are they willing to concede? Because at the end of the day, the service contracts, for example, the service contract law, it's a presidential decree. I wrote in one paper that is actually extra constitutional, because the international oil companies comes into an agreement, the service contract with the Philippine government, and in petroleum law, licensing is not a function of sovereignty. So what happens? It becomes extra constitutional. It becomes the law between the parties. And as a law between the parties, it is as if you entered into a treaty with a foreign company. But at the same time, it's guided by our law, which is the service contract law, which is quite flexible because it has that possibility that you negotiate the terms and conditions, everything in it already, so that there's no need to refer to the law, because the law, the service contract becomes the law between the parties. Our problem, for example, is that there's a pending Supreme Court case wherein the COA questioned why the international oil companies are not paying taxes. They're not paying income taxes. The DOE won the round in the CA under a motion for reconsideration, and the DOE was sustained, and the Court of Appeal said that everything is already in the service contract. There's no need for them to pay income taxes. So that's the nature of a service contract. Unfortunately, the case was appealed to the Supreme Court, and the COA was standing on its position that national income taxes should still be paid. That will dilute the service contract as the agreement between the parties, the totality of agreement between the parties. So that weakens our position with regard to attracting investments in the Philippines, and that includes the BARMM, because if that service contract law itself is weakened, then we are subject to national laws. Even our process of approving oil and gas, for example, in the BARMM is subject to that process. Then we cannot move forward. Even in the issue of the South China Sea, the West Philippine Sea, the joint exploration, actually our service contract can actually service already an agreement between international oil companies, including the Chinese government-owned and controlled corporations, using our framework without violating sovereignty. Because as I said, licensing is not a function of sovereignty. Now, the issue of publish what you pay, the issue of fiscal regime, the issue of what type of arrangements do we have with regard to mining. Our laws are actually quite flexible, particularly with regard to FTA. There's no definition there really in terms of what should appear or what should be the provisions or terms and conditions there, except for the restrictions with regard to 60/40. So I was hearing yesterday some of your presenters saying that the excise tax, for example, is only used here in the Philippines, and it's actually a royalty. True, that's true. Because we are not actually going into production sharing. So while we say mineral production sharing agreement, when you look at our MPSA, it's actually excise tax. It's royalty. But the Constitution provides for production sharing. Production sharing means that the government has a share of that production. But unfortunately, in the case of the Philippines, our service contract itself is a production sharing agreement, for example, with regard to oil companies. But in practice, it's not, because the service contract, what happens is, while it is in the form and manner of a production sharing, we don't share production. We don't get oil. We already automatically convert it into money. So we monetize our share in the oil. When in truth and in fact, a production sharing means we take possession of the oil, or we take possession of the minerals, and the government must have its own mechanism to monetize that mineral. So in other jurisdictions, because that's where I come from, no, in terms of my experience and my studies, my own experience when I was looking at this framework, these laws that across the board. In other countries, they have a GOCC that participates with the investor as a partner to make sure that the production of that mineral, there is already a share of the government, and there is some sort of oversight, some sort of say in how it is developed, because the GOCC is part of that process. In the case of Malaysia, in the case of Indonesia, Pertamina, Petronas in the case of Malaysia, you cannot enter into oil and gas without them being partners. Of course, we have the PNOCEC, for example, in the Malampaya. They have a 10% share there. But it's not in the framework. It's not in the law. They're there because of the FPIF, Filipino Participation Incentive. But that's just an incentive. In the case of Malaysia and Indonesia, it's built into their licensing laws, petroleum licensing or mining laws, that state-owned enterprise must be the partner of the companies, the mining companies. So we have an issue here right now, even in the presidential election, about mining, open pit, about opening the mines and everything. We would have more confidence actually for our people if the government was involved, not just in the granting of license franchise, but in actual operations of the mines. Because we would have people there and people would say, but the Mining Corporation of the Philippines is part of that mine. So we have the control. We also know what they're doing. And we also are able to tackle with regard to the revenue stream, the production stream. What is the proper share of the Philippine government, the taxpayers, the communities? Because we are involved in the governance of the mine itself, not just supervising, not just regulating. So that's one thing I think that the BARMM can do. There's nothing there that prevents the BARMM from creating our own GOCC that we are a partner of these mines. There's nothing there, and I don't see it in the national law that there is a prohibition or a restriction, even though we are subject to national laws. There's no prohibition for us to have our own mining corporate GOCC that will partner with our investors here. Then we are assured. I was hearing Arlene Sibilia in Tawi-Tawi that they want the participation of the stakeholders in the monitoring, in the governance of the mines. The best way to do that is to have GOCC that will be part of those mines, and you can influence the GOCC because now they are subject to government, and the government, of course, at its apex, is always elected officials. So you can have that pressure from the very beginning, and you will have the data more than anything else. You will have somebody that you can run to look at the data. So there will be a layer of oversight, both in the participation as well as in the monitoring grant regulating agencies, the DNR or the MENRE in the case of the BARMM. So I think I have explained those mechanisms, suggestions going forward for the BARMM, which they can look into and you can enhance in your report. Of course, it might need a separate study on what is the impact of state-owned enterprises or GOCCs in the mining or the in the natural resources sector. Of course, some free marketeers are against it. You know, if you're a dyed-in-the-wool capitalist, you would not want state-owned enterprises. In fact, our PSA, our current Public Service Act, which is being amended and now in the process of being approved, there are provisions there which limits the participation of state-owned enterprises and GOCCs.
Okay.
So that's all for the PSA. I don't know how it will impact the mines. Probably not so much because we have our own mining law. But as I said, the BARMM can have its own policies, enhance it, but subject to national law as long as it does not violate those national laws. Then we can have these kinds of enhancements, kinds of mechanisms that will make sure that we get the full benefits of the rents, economic rents from those mines. Because as you know, wealth is not really just money, it's energy, it's the commodities. At the end of the day, how do you look at the mines and minerals and these fossil fuels? These are the real wealth of the land because they're tangible. They're not money, they're not bits and pieces, they're not chips or anything. But at the end of the day, everything starts from a production, a base, and from these materials. That's why the Philippine government is actually not getting the full economic rents, the full value of their mines and minerals. Because once you exhaust that, it's no more, it's gone. It's converted into products, finished products. So we have to take advantage at the very beginning in the mines and minerals. And of course, the added policy there is we can impose what the Indonesians have done, which is to make sure that we have processing here in the Philippines or here in the BARMM. So that's another policy that we can look at, but that's another study.
Yeah.
Heard our Indonesian friend yesterday saying that for a long, long time, there were a lot of issues with regard to imposing a ban on the export of nickel from Indonesia. And it was only, when they started really cracking down and saying, no, you can't export nickel anymore unless you build the processing plant. So that they were forced to. And Freeport McMoran, he was saying, the speaker, had to even build its own processing plant. So if Indonesia can do that, why shouldn't the Philippines also do that? If we targeting to get the full benefits of economic grants in the Philippines from our mines and minerals.
Yeah, thank you, Attorney Ishak. In fact, when you mentioned about the Freeport, I think I and my team at that time was quite involved in providing some policy advice on the planning ministry. I just want to mention that. But I think overall, you are right. You really sparked a discussion about the other legal ambiguities, if you like, or some restrictions that need to be overcome when the mining code and the fiscal policies are going to be drafted. But it's good to hear from you that nothing prevents the Bangsamoro government from creating the GOCC. In some countries, they call it state-owned enterprises. You mentioned Pertamina, you mentioned Petronas. I'm pretty sure that even my colleague Carlos has a lot of experience with GOCCs or SOEs in Latin America. Perhaps we can have that additional conversation later. But I think the point here is that in the report, we have actually mentioned that to consider creating a GOCC with respect not just to mining, but also in oil and gas, because that represents the commercial interest of the government, like many SOEs are. No? But at the same time, it needs to go through the so-called profession. It should be professionally managed, and it's intended to serve the public welfare of the government. And at the same time, it also can be the champion for transparency, not just in data disclosure, but also when it comes to granting licenses or doing the auction, those kinds of things, and also when it comes to the disclosure of the contracts. I think this is something that can be hopefully discussed as part of the. I think it's not just about the mining code, the fiscal regime, but I think it can also be part of the broader discussion of the Bangsamoro Sustainable Development Strategy about the role of GOCCs on that front. So certainly, I think we're just sparked other discussions which are quite related on what do we do with the GOCC. I think we don't have the time, but hopefully it can generate further research on that front, the potential use or generation of the GOCC. But please, Attorney Ishak, stay with us. I'm sure there will be some questions that will be given to you later. But in the interest of time, I'd like us to move now to get the reaction from the two mining companies. Let's begin with Mr. Antonio Raniego Labial, who is the Mine Accounting and Finance Manager of Mina Vida de Mindanao. It's your turn now, sir. Thank you for patiently waiting.
Pwede na yun, ma'am? Pwede. Sir, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Loud and clear.
Sir, actually, hindi ako naka-attend ng first day na discussion. Now, ang masasabi ko lang dito, sir, is we as partners of the government are complying financial regulatory requirements, including as those required by mining law and other related circulars. Now, finally, sir, I would say the formulation of a sound mining law is urgent, considering the nickel mining operation is short-lived. If delayed, maybe we are out of the picture by the time the new mining code is laid down.
Okay, that's clear and straightforward. Would you like to say something else, or you better elaborate that later if there are questions that come your way.
Sir, yun na lang po, sir. Yun na, sir.
Okay, I think that's loud and clear. Let's then move to to Engineer Charles B. Semilia, who is the MSHAED Manager of Chansey Mining Incorporated. Tawi-tawi.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. Assalamualaikum. We would like to thank first Bantay Kita for having us, by inviting us to this discussion as one of the reactors. We would also like to thank all the speakers and other responders for their insights and inputs that are important to consider for the creation of mining policy for Bangsamoro region. Sa private sector, we are looking forward to a robust mining policy for the Bangsamoro region that is in line with the principle of sustainable development. We are hoping that this policy would encourage investments in commercial mining activities and would promote fair sharing of benefits and costs from the exploration, development, and utilization of the mineral resources in the region. We believe that a well-governed mining industry could enable BARMM to generate potential economic opportunities from utilizing its minerals, and that the institutions, including the Ministry of Environment, Natural Resources, and Energy, or MNRE, must be strengthened by providing competent staff for the ministry in order to enforce rules and make competent decisions that uphold the rights of all stakeholders in the mining sector. Lastly, we are hoping that the mining code that is being developed would ensure efficient and effective oversight and monitoring of mining companies' compliance with regards to environmental and social safeguards, including the allocation of funds, as well as collection of taxes and fees, in order to achieve responsible mining and good governance in the Bangsamoro region. That would create a positive image of what is mining to people. I think that's all for us, this discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Engineer Similia. Now, before I know that Mr. Chito has a question, are you still in the room, Mr. Chito? You raise your hand. Please identify yourself and also to whom are you directing your question, please? Mr. Chito?
Yes, sir. Good morning po sa lahat, no? I'm sharing some inputs as a community member and perhaps a member also of the PCIPI MSG. Well, I wish BARMM Imbre would embrace certain experiences that we have in our community. First is there should be a definition of the natural resource utilization in the area, because we experience now the conflict of resource utilization. For instance, our area has been identified as a protected area, so that is a very rich in biodiversity. It's a key biodiversity area, but here is the Mines and Geosciences Bureau approving mining tenements in the area. So that's one thing, no? And aside from that, we see the importance of the Land Use Act, no? Perhaps the local governments of the BARMM can raise that issue, because with the climate context that we have, the climate change, no, local communities really are suffering the brunt of climate change. So unlike in our area, the Republic Act 7160 empowers the local governments to ensure that the rights, the constitutional rights of the people to healthful and balanced ecology that has been devolved to local governments. So local governments can assert the exercise of such power to protect the general welfare of the constituents. No? And other one would be points of reflection could be the sharing about the share of the government in the mining contracts, because as presented well by the speakers, what the government is receiving is only the royalties. So it's not technically an income by the government. So and the excise taxes are distributed to the provincial, municipal, and barangay levels. But what is left to the national government is still a questionable issue, because you know, with that has been also endorsed by the MSG, the issue on energy transition, wherein the climate issue really is a very hot issue globally, and we need transparency on the resources or the minerals that has been extracted. If the government does not have an income, sufficient income to determine what are the minerals present from that extracted, no, it cannot plan, no, we cannot manage well what we do not know, no. So we should, the government must have a knowledge, as mentioned by Dr. Shelo, that we should know what we have the extracted, no, minerals, no. So the mining companies are only paying for nickel if that is the contracts that they have signed. So all these things would also involve the local governments, especially the BARMM, and their local development plans. Now, you can see mining companies would say that they have the SDMP, they have the APEP, and they have the CSR, but the mandatory expenditures based on the COA findings are not treated as public funds. That's why there is a difficulty of auditing whether the SDMP 5-year plans and the APP 5-year plans, as well as the annual SDMP and DPP, are properly implemented. So in one mine audit, I discovered that there are companies that did not submit annual SDMP and EPEP because of some alibis. But so if there is no strict monitoring and there is no review on this to make it more public, no, still that will be a source of corruption, because you know, global witnesses have already sad stories about this in the local areas where the corruption issues really stemming from the non-monitoring well of the EPEP and the SDMP funds, because these are still private funds, although that is mandatory because the law requires the mining companies to allocate such amount. Now, the MICC just recently published the findings and recommendations. So the you know, parameters that have been used by the DNR need to be evaluated, because some are obsolete. Really,
Sir Chito. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm not sure how many more. Sorry to interrupt. Just in the interest of time, how many more minutes do you think you would need? Sorry.
Just 2 minutes more, sir.
Okay.
It's
if you
okay.
could make it quicker, thanks.
Yes, all these things. My point is the things I am presenting are points of reflection because I understand that BARMM, EMRE would be would need guidance on how they will formulate their mining legislation, the legal framework for natural resource governance in BARMM. So all these things are experiences of the community here in non-BARMM areas. So we in the PCIT MSG would really try to set standards, no, that we can contribute also to the proper management of the natural resources in BARMM. So with this, I would like to say thank you for the opportunity to share our views, hoping that we can help our brothers in the BARMM area. Thank you po. Maraming salamat.
Thank you, Sir Chito, because you're coming from the experience of from Caraga and Surigao del Sur, which is, we would say mining country in the Philippines. So you have seen the good and the bad. And it's good that as part of your points of reflection, you highlighted the role of the LGUs, the climate change consideration of mining, because some of these mining areas are also prone to natural disasters. So consider also mining and its links with disaster risk reduction. Also, an important issue of locating mining in the context of the land use change or land use change plan. So lots to consider there. So I think again you highlighted the intersectionality or cross-sectorial relevance of mining. You could just not have discussion on improving mining governance and without actually looking at other sectorial issues that are linked with it. No, again, thanks, Sir Chito. Now, I want us to go back to the discussion on the revenue allocation since we still have Carlos here. I think Attorney Ishraq also mentioned the importance of creating a fund and the role of the GOCC. So, and also yesterday, there was a mention by Ma'am Arlene Sevilla about the creation of the Community Wealth Fund as a more efficient and effective platform wherein the share of the community from mining revenues can be better used and managed for long-term gains. So I think the question now actually goes to Carlos and Brenda. Carlos, in your experience in Peru and in Latin America, what are the good practices? I'm not looking at the bad ones. What are the good practices in terms of the creation and in the performance of this so-called state-owned enterprises in mining and or petroleum in terms of managing the government share in the commercial venture in mining? Also, that's number one. And to what extent have they been useful in sharing the rent or revenues to the community? That's the question for you. If you could cite one example in terms of a good study, I think that will be useful. Now, as to the SOE and Community Wealth Fund question for Brenda, has it been part of the disclosure or reporting of EITI member countries when it comes to the disclosure performance of the GOCCs in mining? And has Community Wealth Fund been an increasing, I would say, recourse for communities to better manage their share of the revenue? So, good question to you, Carlos.
Okay, quickly. In Latin America, there are very few examples of state-owned mining companies. Very few. I would say the good examples are coming from Chile. In Chile, you have something called Codelco, La del Cobre. the copper one. That's the literal translation. Codelco, which is a national-owned copper company, which is in fact the largest copper producer in the world. And it's very well managed, very professionally managed. It competes with the companies, the private companies, also operating in the sector. To my knowledge, it has not presented corruption scandals or something like that ever. And the point is that they contribute to 30% of the Chilean copper production, but contribute to 60% of the mining fiscal incomes in Chile. So it's efficiently managed, and it contributes in a very, very important way to Chile's copper incomes, So it's not an inefficient or corrupt, badly managed company that ends up costing money to the government, Because then you need to subsidize it or bankroll bad debts or whatnot. This is very well managed, very professionally managed. Now, Codelco has another very interesting feature that links to the question of climate change, which I think Sheila Magno and some others mentioned. Codelco is leading the charge to clean up its entire mining operation, including land transportation, claiming that in a certain period of time, they will generate 0 greenhouse effect gases. They are migrating their production sites to solar and aeolic energy, and they are migrating their transportation fleet to hydrogen. And they are starting to market something called Chile's green copper or sustainable copper, looking ahead into the kind of demand that will come from the market, as cars migrate to electricity. They understand that consumers will be asking, how is this copper produced? Because an electric car consumes a huge amount of copper, And so I think they are betting on the future and leading the charge of mining in Latin America regarding both transparency, efficiency, good management, and responding to the challenge of climate change. So I think if you want to look at a positive example, and then I can later share studies or reports about how Codelco works and whatnot, The Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean is sort of promoting Codelco as a good example. Let me just very quickly mention that Chile has a second mining company which responds to the challenge of informal mining, small-scale informal mining, and this is a state-owned mining company that buys the gold and buys copper and buys the minerals in general from small-scale producers and provides them with credit and provides them with technical assistance, but offers them a formal channel to avoid them going completely informal, and it refines the copper it buys, and it sells the copper with value added because it is a state-owned company, it doesn't make a profit. Its main goal, is to keep the expansion of informal mining under check, and it's successful. And it's also being promoted by ECLAC as a good example of a way a government or the state can respond to the challenge of informality in the mining sector, which is a challenge that is growing in the region. It's out of control in some countries like Peru or Colombia and Bolivia, But in Chile, that has been the response. So these are two examples of state-owned mining companies that serve completely different purposes, but are well managed, professionally managed, and are giving good results.
Can we go to Attorney Brenda? Disclosure of state-owned enterprises or GOCCs in mining, and how does Community Wealth Fund now look like? She's already gone. Okay, that's good. Now, the time now is 11:46. What I wanted to do here is I would like to get the last set of response from Attorney Ishak, because I think he has heard much. We actually would like to hear from him about some of the way forward for Bangsamoro government with respect to the development of revenue code and mining code and other related strategies. That's one. But I saw that Ma'am Arlene Sevilla is actively listening. I also would like to hear from her before you, Attorney Ishak, if she has anything else to say from yesterday, because she has been a proponent of Community Wealth Fund as another measure to a mechanism to manage community share from the revenue. Ma'am Arlene, are you still with us?
Yes, sir. Good morning.
Okay. Anything to add?
On the financial aspect po ng sa pagmimina sa BARMM, lalo na dito sa Tawi-Tawi, praying that in the framing of the mining code for the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region, the policies would be laid down for responsible utilization of the Community Wealth Fund by the host communities themselves, and it should be utilized by them for post-mining activities to ensure that their children and their grandchildren will be able to have proper education, finish college education, have health facilities that would ensure good health for the community and sustainable livelihood and source of income, so that without the minerals in their community, they would still have a decent way of life.
Thank you, Miss Arlene, for sharing your thoughts. Very good. Now, I know that it's getting too late in Lima. It's now 10:48 p.m. in Lima. So, Carlos, any last word from you?
Only a word of appreciation for being invited to participate in this super interesting panel. One final thing that I would like to add is that in Peru and elsewhere in Latin America, there is also an open debate about the convenience or not of local content policies, and the strengthening of value chains around mining. Because for some, that it's a needed thing so that mining doesn't operate as an enclave, but as it demands goods and services from the local economy, then it shares part of the wealth that it creates, and there are benefits for those that manage to engage in the provision of such goods and services. So they see mining as a driver of processes of value added. But on the other hand, some people fear that that will increase the dependency of the entire territory regarding mining. So now it's not only the mining company and the workers in the mining company that depend on that activity, but you have bigger and larger sectors of the local economy that get hooked up to mining, which is by nature a non-renewable resource. It will come to an end in 20, 30, 40 years, maybe at the most. So what will happen with that entire sector of providers of goods and services once the mining operation closes? Of course, the theory is that knowledge and capital accumulated while providing goods and services to the mining company, could be applied elsewhere. So you shouldn't just provide a good and service to the mining company. You should save some money, accumulate some capital, invest it elsewhere. That's theory, but that's not necessarily what happens, no? So that's another open debate, no? Is it convenient to foster local content policies and through them foster these provision chains, no? Or is there the risk of increasing dependency, and therefore when the mining operation ceases, you may have a collapse of, you may have to deal not only with the workers of the mine who end up without a job, but you may have the collapse of entire sector of the economy that have become dependent on that activity. You know, that's an issue I hadn't mentioned. I think it's super important to actually discuss the pros and cons. Again, as in many other issues, there is no correct response. There are many responses that depend on circumstances and leadership and the nature of companies and local governments and whatnot. So excuse me for leaving. It's over 11 p.m. here. I have some early appointments tomorrow morning. But thank you again. I have enjoyed it. I have learned. I hope I have contributed some ideas. And please count on me for whatever you want to do that requires a comparison with Latin America. Count on me. Thank you very much.
Yeah, muchas gracias, amigo. I hope that this is not the last, but hopefully the first to catalyze interaction with you and your colleagues in Peru. So again, thank you and have a good night's sleep.
Thank you.
All right. Attorney Ishak.
I think what the professor from Peru, or our guest from Peru, said is very important. Actually, there is a choice for the BARMM, whether or not we want mines and minerals, natural resources to be a source of our economic development when we don't have yet the mechanisms, the laws, policies in place to make sure that we benefit fully from these natural resources. Actually, there's now an ongoing debate in Tawi-Tawi whether or not it's more strategic to develop the tourism industry than the mining industry. Just as the tourism industry is still taking off, because as you know, with the coming of the BARMM as a symbol of the implementation of the peace agreement, there's a lot of interest in investors. So are we going to attract more mining investors, or are we going to attract more investors, for example, in tourism and agriculture and other industries? And especially in Tawi-Tawi, wherein they really have a problem on land use as well as water use, because their biggest source actually of natural wealth is not the mines, but for the ordinary people is the seaweeds. The seaweeds industry depends on pristine waters, depends on waters that there's a fast current, and that's why, for example, it's discouraged to use fertilizer because it destroys that resource. No, instead of being pure resource, it becomes something else. So seaweed industry is fast growing and growing by leaps and bounds exponentially because it's an alternative food crop. It's an alternative for food security. So in India, for example, they are already experimenting and making sure that they have seaweeds, because as climate change arrives, there will be more places that will be inundated by water, by the seas, by the oceans. And there will be less land for us to develop for agriculture, for food security. So there will come a time that we will really need the sea for growing our food crops. And one of the most advanced, or at least potential for food security, is the seaweed, because it's cheap, it's nutritious, and every day there is new inventions coming out with regard to the uses of the seaweed. And in the case of Tawi-Tawi, 70% of, or 60%, probably now 40%, because the data has been going down, of the Philippines comes from that place. So the question for them now would be whether they enjoy more economic rents, more economic development through the mines, or through this use of seaweeds and also their tourism industry. So in parting, these are debates that will have to be determined at the halls of the parliament and the BARMM government. But let me also point out that in the BOL, there's a provision there on preferential rights of bona fide residents of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region. It says there that qualified citizens who are bona fide residents of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region, all other conditions being equal, shall have preferential rights over the exploration, development, and utilization of natural resources, including uranium, fossil fuels, such as petroleum, natural gas, and coal within the territorial jurisdiction of the Bangsamoro. Existing rights over the exploration, development, and utilization of natural resources shall be respected until the expiration of the corresponding leases, permits, franchises, or concessions unless legally terminated. So this jives in with my suggestion that we come up with our own GOCC, because the GOCC is already a resident precisely because it's part of the BARMM government. And in the grant of those licenses, if the BARMM government itself can exploit those resources in partnership with the LGU or the outside investors, then because we need outside investors, definitely they have the technology, they have the know-how, they have the efficiencies, because we know GOCCs for the most part are inefficient, as we have experienced. Of course, there's the example also of China, wherein they have the competing GOCCs, so they're forced to be efficient. But in any case, this is one measure that we can look into. That's why, if, for example, Bangsamoro residents form their own corporations, whether it's GOCC or on their own as investors, then they can have that preferential right. They can actually lobby or insist on the application of this preferential right of bona fide residents of the Bangsamoro, so that the exploiters or the ones who are actually mining or doing the development of those natural resources are from the place. But of course, it doesn't mean that you're from the place that you will have good governance of the natural resources. We have the experience, of course, of resource curse in the Dutch disease, as explained by the resource person from Peru. And he pointed out that it crowds out the other industries. So if you're not yet well advanced in the ladder of development and you introduce mines and minerals as one of your primary sources of revenues, then it exacerbates actually the rent seeking. That is the experience of the resource curse in the Dutch disease. It crowds out. So I think is the objective of this program, the Bantay Kita EITI initiative, is to make sure it was really a reaction to all this rent seeking that happened in Africa and elsewhere in the third world countries, wherein mines and minerals and natural resources are exploited, and most of the resources end up in Swiss bank accounts or in London. So the idea of Publish What You Pay is to make sure that there's an accounting of all the monies that are being extracted, or at least the monies that are being paid by the companies to the governments or the authorities, so that we can account that these monies are not actually being siphoned off elsewhere. Because as you know, mining is not a very value-added business with regard to creating industries. It's not like, for example, manufacturing. So you have to guard very well your mines. You have to guard very well the production. At the end of the day, it's the production where you have to make sure that it's monetized, that is accounted for. In particular, if you're talking about copper and gold, but gold in particular, because gold is money in itself, and copper and gold is actually a mixture in mines. And if we have that, have not yet heard, then of course that is a big source of wealth, because the gold itself, that's why it's the central bank that buys it. It's already money. We are already digging out money. But now in the age of renewable energy, wherein the car industry, in particular the electric car industry, is booming, our natural resources like nickel, copper, and other stuff are now very valuable because we need more of these minerals, these metals, in order to go in transition into the new economy. But the irony here is that the mining itself is very fossil fuel intensive because you need a lot of diesel, you need a lot of heavy equipment. So these are the challenges that are facing us, not only here in the Philippines, but all over the world. So uh, the challenges for the Philippines, of course, is we are very near China, and China is a big consumer of this mineral wealth. A lot of our export is going to China, and we are one of those very near mineral-rich countries, very near China. So our supply chain to supply China is short, so it makes a lot of efficiencies. But since natural resources are finite, they're not, as one of the speakers here, the local government unit, rather the resource person from Canada was saying, in the case of nickel, it's not very long term. So we have to make sure we get the best out of the use of these resources. So I will end there now because now becomes a lecture and it will go into other areas. So my suggestion is really we have to make that decision. One, do we go with a state-owned enterprise type of development, wherein the driver of development would be a GOCC, more or less state-led, with regard to mines and minerals? Two, we have a more laissez-faire, wherein we continue as we are doing now, because it's easier actually from a free market perspective to ask investors to come in and do the stuff for us, and at the same time have a more stricter regulation or a hybrid. We do a mix of state-owned at the same time private sector. So I think this is doable. If you ask my suggestion, the hybrid would be more useful in crafting our mining code, for example. But that's a discussion for another day. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Attorney Ishak. No, we don't mind that you gave a lecture. I think this is essential part of the exchange. So I'd like to give a quick wrap up from what we heard in this discussion without diluting some of the other essential details. 5 only. First, it's clear from a first hour 2-day discussion that the development of the mining code is urgent. This has been confirmed by all the stakeholders, and it's also in the priority of the Bangsamoro leadership. When you say mining code, it also has to cover the artisanal and small scale mining. It's clear that while there are areas that have had their resource depleting, such as in Languyan, there are also other mining rich areas such as in mainland BARMM, also in Sulu, and others where there's a potential. However, when the mining code is being developed, it needs to be developed not just for the purpose of putting the regulation, but it should have a long-term view or perspective. Basically, you need to locate the mining code in terms of the broader long-term sustainable development strategy. So that's why it's important that it gets linked with the Bangsamoro development plan. And also, we need to look at the mining code should also be seen not just to allow mining extraction and exploration and development only, but it must also serve its purpose as a potential growth driver. And when you say growth driver, it must also catalyze so-called multiplier effect, no? Or we can call it economic diversification. Now, with regards to the discussion today, the second point is that the mining code should also be linked with the fiscal autonomy provision of the Bangsamoro Organic Law. And this includes linking it with the development of the revenue code. And with the revenue code, the discussion this morning from the presentation from the resource persons is that There are several models to make the taxation fair and also progressive. So Dr. Sheila cited some different models. At the same time, there are also different ways in which you can develop the formula for revenue sharing and how you can effectively allocate those resource revenue, not just to the regional government, local government, but also to the community. And community wealth fund has been cited as one way to manage that, as opposed to simply giving it to them for the purpose of charity or social responsibility. But if there's a better mechanism where community can have a better handle on their revenue, I think it's an area that needs to be explored, because it can in part address the so-called intergenerational equity. And when talking about community wealth fund, there are several community wealth funds that have actually been developed, in Indonesia. I think there is one that is being piloted in Zamboanga. Bantay Kita is actually supporting that. And they have already developed the community wealth fund there. So I think Bantay Kita can facilitate that kind of experience sharing. Also, while mentioning that, the fourth point is that there are some ambiguities or some apparent legal restrictions in terms of the sharing the revenue and making in how you make decision about mining, with particular reference to Attorney Ishak's mention of the contracts and the license allocation. I think that's an area that needs to be discussed, and which brought me to the fifth point, which is that the Bangsamoro Organic Law, when he cited the specific article there, which gives preferential rights to Bangsamoro people. And I think that's a very important legal tool that you can assert when it comes to, for example, addressing not just the licensing or contractual terms, but also in terms of establishing your so-called GOCC and SOE. In our experience, there are so-called extractive-based or mineral or petroleum-based, GOCCs that have been established with a long-term view of not just managing the government or autonomous government's commercial interests, but also to serve public good, public welfare. But doing so would require professional management. It also needs a clear oversight, and certainly the importance of data and inclusivity in the process. So those are I think 5 key takeaways from this discussion. I hope that this exchange has been useful to everybody. And just to highlight that in terms of the participation to this session, we are being joined by the leadership from MENRE, also from the BTA. We also have participants from the MICC, PHEITI. I think we'll have more than 60 in the Zoom. And in addition to that, there are also participants who join us via the FB live stream. Just a note that this live stream is being kept by Bantay Kita and IAG in their Facebooks. You can always make reference to it. I know that we also have researchers from Peru that join us, who was doing the research on the mining and quarrying, artisanal mining in Maguindanao. Hopefully this can be shared as well. We are being joined as well by the networks partners of IAG. We have the Asia Foundation and several other organizations. So I think this discussion has actually not just brought some like-minded, if you like, groups, but hopefully it is going to spark not just further debate, but a more serious policy research and study to inform this priority code development in Bangsamoro. So with that, I wanted to thank again MENRE and IAG for co-hosting these events. If you have more questions, if you would like to get a copy of the report as well as this presentation, we can make that available. I think we just need to arrange that with Bantay Kita. So again, on that note, thank you to all the speakers. and have a good lunch, everybody. So now we have lots of food for thought this morning. This is the right time to have your own food for the stomach. And if we still have the resource persons, speakers, and others who join us in Zoom, please open your video. We would just like to have a group photo for documentation, and I think that's a good way. And that's a good way. So, okay. So please open your video, and Bantay Kita will count 1 to 3 when you're all on screen. Okay, that's good. So Ans, over to you.
Yes po, smile lang po. 1, 2, 3. Isa po. 1, 2, 3.
Maraming salamat po.
Thank you.
And wassalam. So, thank you. An end now.
Thank you. Salamat po sa lahat.
Thank you. Are you ending it, Ange? Or we?
Ended the live stream na po. And then for a while, we'll also end the Zoom na rin. Thank you po sa lahat. Thank you.
Salamat po.
Right.